Mary was supposed to hook that up, so when she gets back, we'll ask her. So everybody has an agenda now? All right, great. Well, I'm going to let our esteemed directors kick off the day. We're very fortunate in the North Central region to have two extremely enlightened directors that really support and promote this integrated social ecological systems vulnerability and adaptation research. So I'm going to let Jeff, I guess, go ahead and get started.
Oh, thanks, Shannon. Flattering, but you're setting the bar too high. Welcome. This is, I think everybody's figured out where the coffee is and where the restrooms, and there's, if you want just a drinking fountain, it's sort of where the center was, but just on the right-hand side of that hallway, kind of behind the bathrooms over there. The idea behind the climate science centers, as you probably know, there's 8 of them regionally, part of the secretarial order that established the Landscape Conservation Cooperative and the climate science centers within the Department of Interior to help bring the best science to land managers and assist with tribal needs. And there's 22 landscape conservation cooperatives, so there's more of those, and there's a little bit smaller region. Unfortunately, I think they don't overlap with they don't nest within the 8 climate centers, so there's boundary mismatch issues, but there's kind of north, south, and then east, central, and west of the climate science centers, with Alaska and the Pacific Islands being the other 2. So we're the North Central Climate Science Center housed at with the host institution of Colorado State University, along with 8 other universities. We, this year, or I think it was just the very end of December 2012, published our 5-year science strategy that I think does give us some decent marching orders, or does establish what we're doing. It kind of lays out the mission, bringing the best possible climate science to inform land management decisions. Within that 5-year plan, we adopted or developed this concept that we call the resource for vulnerability assessment, adaptation, and mitigation planning, which is the acronym REVAMP. And the idea is to think about all those things and see if we can provide an extension, almost an extension service from some of the Glick and Stein that was talked about on Wednesday, the Scanning Conservation Horizon document. There's also the ACT framework that Molly Cross has read. There's other things with IPCC, adaptation, mitigation. There's a lot going on. The National Climate Assessment. There's training at the National Conservation Training Center. So there's a lot of information that's being brought to Department of Interior or tribes to understand vulnerability assessment, adaptation, mitigation. And as we laid out in that 5-year plan, we think that those are not exactly trivial concepts, you know, downscaling climate. Now we got CNET 3 and CNET 5. It's like taking a drink out of a fire hydrant. There's a lot coming at us just with the climate information. And then there's the modeling to relate that climate to fish and wildlife, the impacts of that climate change or vulnerability or that climate variability to the living species or the ecology that land managers are concerned about. And then there's that human dimension, and Dennis teaches a class with Terry Chapin's text, and there's the whole IPCC idea that's moving, I think, more towards adaptation and mitigation, trying to understand that, and the science behind it, as Dennis says, the hard, soft science behind that connection. And so this revamp concept is trying to pull those together to provide a resource for these fairly complex issues that people can go to, as opposed to just taking a 3-day course. We're here as a resource to help them do that. We're just kind of getting up on that. But part of that revamp concept is foundational science areas. We're building on 3 different foundational science areas. I call them abiotic, biotic, and human is one way to think of them. It's basically the fundamental climate and understanding climate impact, or climate and how climate is changing or projected to change. The impacts on the natural world, living things, that's biotic, and then they're bringing that to that vulnerability assessment or that human dimension to it. So the revamp concept builds on those 3 foundational science areas. The foundational science areas for the climate is we're trying to have team leads for each of these 3 areas. We're still negotiating and figuring out who the climate lead would be. That's Chris Anderson out of Iowa State University, but he's taking a tenure track job and kind of not able to continue with that, so we need to fill that in. Andy Hansen is leading the impacts team, or that foundational area. And Dennis, with help from Shannon, are leading that adaptation mitigation theme of that third foundational science area. So that's just the context of where this meeting and this group fall in, is that you're part of this team in the foundational science area, the adaptation and mitigation, human dimension part of it. So I think that's enough for me to provide the context. I'll let Dennis kind of fill you guys in on today's meeting. I'm going to switch my seat, which is back over there.
So Mary just brought a little sliver with the wireless information on it, so if you want to take one.
And you'd have to eat those.
They really are a sliver.
So, sort of looking at understanding of climate change impact in our region, and it's a quite interesting region of the United States that includes the Rocky Mountains and the Great Plains and it's headwaters of the Missouri River Basin, and which then extends into the Mississippi. So it's really an important region for a number of different reasons. It also includes a lot of the federal lands. And looking at how we actually, taking the remap concept and looking at how do we incorporate strategies and support strategies in adaptation, looking at decision making, and looking at management issues within our region, it was premature to really put something forward as a research project. And so last year about this time when we met in Montana, rather than proposing specific, sort of pet projects, what we came up with, it was because of looking at the broad expertise in the region, doing adaptation work, working with managers, really looking at issues of the social structures in the context in which they deal with climate change issues and management changes in the system that was really challenging their management practices. That we came up with the idea of, well, let's develop a community, a network of practitioners and researchers that really can provide us a framework, a much more comprehensive research agenda for this type of effort. And taking on board the idea of really highlighting the socio-ecological interface, because we have a lot of strengths in both the sort of conservation ecological community, we have a lot of strengths in the social science communities, but then bringing them together to where we can actually start formulating fundamental questions that really look at that interface so that we understand sort of not only sort of the type of vulnerabilities of different species or habitats, vulnerabilities of natural resources, but the implications of what that means as we include livelihoods and look at institutional framing of how agencies deal with these things. And so it's as Jeff alluded to, it's a much more complicated landscape that we're trying to manage around, where we include considerations of the social dimension and the social science approaches to deal and understand those, and to be able to use those in a way to inform our research agenda and also to inform our operational partners and managers in the field of how we can incorporate these concepts, look at management action in a way that is more agile, recognizes the type of dynamic changes that we're dealing with day in, day out, and not have them throw out their management schemes, but actually incorporate change into their thinking. And for us as at least a lot of us here are academics or researchers, really trying to get our heads around what is it on the operational side that they need to deal with, and how do you incorporate this theory into an operational framework of what managers do. And so, in the solicitation of invitations going out to all of you, you seem to be willing to work in this sort of strange, dynamic, this transition zone between ecological and social dimensions. in trying to really move the research agenda and the operational agendas forward. But that's what we're about. We're not funding any particular projects. I think collectively, as we see new ideas emerge, I'm hoping that we actually then look at how do we actually join in collaboration with each other in different parts of the region, on different sectors or issues, and that this working group then kind of builds as a community that network of practice from research to operations for these joint activities. That's our hope when building this working group. We're really thinking about how do we actually identify these different activities and look at opportunities for research or operational things, and build new resources for this type of activity. So that's what we're about, and that's part, as you can see in the agenda, that's sort of our expectations, that's our list of outcomes for this type of working group and for this meeting. So hopefully we have a lot of dialogue about this through the day. So with that, I'd like to go around and have people introduce themselves. And remind you also that we are recording this, and we have some folks possibly calling in later on.
I don't know if it is recording.
I think so, with the red light blinking, I think means you're recording. Up there, right?
Is it? Okay.
Yep.
How do I get the full screen back?
I'm sharing your screen. Stop
Okay,
sharing.
I'm just going to make sure the little recorder thing is active.
I think that red dot there. See the red dot that's blinking?
Oh, there we go.
Yeah.
Okay, good.
Already blinked.
So, hi Andrea. Just another logistic question. We're going to need power sooner or later for laptops.
We'll check and see if there's
So, yeah, we're just going to, we have about 10 minutes to go around the room, and just everybody say your name, your affiliation, and sort of why you're here today. What sort of motivated you here, and what you hope to get out of participating in this group. So I'll start. I'm Shannon McNeely. I'm the Adaptation Fellow here at CSU. It's in our Central Climate Science Center. And my objectives are lengthy. They're on your agenda. And I think, really those objectives are sort of an ongoing objective list that we see this all as kind of a continuum. And I'll talk about our progress to date and where we're going with that and everything. But Lisa, if you want to go next.
Sure. Lisa Dilling from the University of Colorado Boulder. I have a lot of different hats. I can tell you all my different hats. In this context here, I'm part of the Western Water Assessment, and I'll talk briefly about that if you guys don't know what that is. I'm sure many of you are familiar. I'm also assistant professor in environmental studies there, and a member of CERES, the Cooperative Institute for Research in Environmental Studies, the Sciences, got that right, Sciences, and a member of the Center for Science and Technology Policy Research. And
Okay, your affiliations took up all your time.
That's all. I'm getting to talk later, so you'll So you'll hear from me anyway. So
yeah, she's good. Betsy?
I'm Betsy Neely. I'm with the Nature Conservancy. I'm a conservation planner and am working with the Southwest Climate Change Initiative, and we're working with local communities across the 4 states in the Southwest to prepare for change. And I'm leading the effort in the Gunnison Basin on the West Slope. And we're about to embark on developing adaptation strategies across the whole basin, and we're really interested in better incorporating the social and human dimension into that effort. We've been heavily focused on the ecological side, and we're really looking forward to working with you and learning from this group.
Thanks. Maria?
I'm Maria Fernandez. I'm a professor in forest and rangeland stewardship here. My research group is the Rangeland Social Ecosystem team, and we work on climate change impacts and adaptation, especially food management, primarily in Mongolia, a little bit of Spain, and in the U.S. I do a lot of work more on rancher decision making and adaptive management, and so I'm here to kind of learn what you all are doing and how we can better interface. I also teach undergraduate, integrated ecosystem management, adaptive management scenario planning, all these tools that I think the next generation of land managers are gonna need. So it's, I'm here to kind of learn what's going on, how I can handle that to landowners, agencies I work with.
My name is Tim Hong-Tan. I'm assistant professor in the community regional planning program at University of Nebraska Lincoln. My fundamental interest is how the planners can respond to the climate change uncertainty as well as the related extreme events. So I think I have done a lot of work at the national level, and when I met with Sharon encouraged me probably we need to focus a little with this region, I think, with more funds. So I think, yeah, it's a good time to make and come here. That's why I come here.
Great.
I'm Dan Williams. I'm with the Rocky Mountain Research Station building just over here. I'm a research social scientist, so I've been dealing with human dimensions, for multiple decades now. I've got a project going in the North Central region on community adaptation vulnerability, and we'll talk more about that later.
Yep.
Karina Webber from the University of Montana. I'm the postdoc on Dan's project at my research interests are really at the sort of intersection between science and governance and practice, and how we can kind of stop thinking about science and governance as these kind of polar extremes that never come together. So I think in that space. So I'm interested to learn more about what you guys are doing.
Bill Travis, I'm a geographer at the University of Colorado, and I'm out of what we used to call the natural hazard school. And I still think a lot and focus my work on how people make choices in extreme events.
You know who Jeff is, John? He already introduced himself. We don't have time.
I'm John Gross. I'm with the National Park Service here in Fort Collins, Colorado, down on Harmony, about 6 miles or so south of here. And I work a lot in climate change with parks and other people all over. And so I guess I'm here to learn about how we can better integrate social aspects into some of the work we're doing. But really kind of, the overall goal is to better manage the parks, whatever it takes.
I'm Kristen David. I'm late. I apologize. I'm starting as usual. I'm the newly minted director of the Western Water Association. I'll take so. I'm also the associate director of science for the series, the Cooperative Institute of the University of Colorado Boulder, and I seem to just be collecting jobs right now.
Hi, I'm Cody Knudsen. I'm a research associate professor on the School of Natural Resources at the University of Nebraska Lincoln, and a social scientist with the National Drought Mitigation Center within the school. And I'm just here I'm going to tell you a little bit about some of the work we do in a minute, and see if some of that might be applicable to some of the work you're doing, and maybe share some methodology and strategies.
I'm Nick Kelly. I'm a ecologist with the Climate Change Response Program with the Park Service here in Fort Collins. I was able to attend today because it was within bicycling. That's why I couldn't put out again for it.
Yeah. But you participated virtually, so.
I did, yes. That happened. Yeah. So my background is in vegetation ecology and thinking about how global change agents are impacting vegetation dynamics. And I just started my position with Park Service in January, and really working on climate change adaptation, both at the planning and so their management plans, making sure that they're thinking about climate change with the type of planning that they're doing. And then what I'm really interested in is also then applying some adaptation actions, especially thinking about natural resources and looking at vulnerability assessment scenario planning. Really starting to build a history of adaptation actions and how efficacious they are, where are the stumbling points, and how can we build it.
Apparently they get your shirt when you come.
Andrea?
I got a shirt. Wildlife shirt.
especially long range. And I'm involved with the climate, with several, we have some joint projects, pilot projects with some of the ecologists involved. Trying to really figure out how you put the pixels and bits of climate projection into ecological modeling.
None of these as you can say. Before you go, Rudy, I just want to jump in here really quick to say the next 4 people introducing themselves that have all helped with organizing both the National Adaptation Forum session and today. So I want to thank Rudy, Nina, and our student assistant, Mary, and Geneva. And Geneva's taking notes, so I'll let you guys, I want to make sure I did that before I forgot. Go ahead, Rudy, introduce yourself.
Rudy Schuster, I'm with the United States Geological Survey across the street over on Center Avenue. We have a group over there in the Fort Collins Science Center called the Policy Analysis Scientific Systems Branch, and I'm chief of that branch. And we're a group of social scientists who do work for mostly other U.S., for other Department of Interior agencies as well as for USGS programs. So we do a lot of work for a lot of you folks, Park Service, Fish and Wildlife Service, BLM. We have political scientists, such as Nina right here. We have economists. We have generalists that do human natural resource type of work. We do a lot of survey work. And so it's an interesting group kind of nestled right here. And we work collaboratively with all the other agencies and across share of universal basis. A little bit of an advertisement by giving you a snapshot of the group. We vary in size depending on the field season from mid-20s, 25 to 32 or 3 people, depending on how many students we have running around bugging people.
Nina Burkhart, and I work with Rudy. I won't tell you the whole thing again, but I'm a political scientist by training. I'm a research social scientist. And so I'm interested in things. I'm interested in governance, sort of the safety of governance stuff like you mentioned. I'm really interested in some of these ideas about adaptation. So you look at, sort of, we'll talk generally about social adaptation, but I think there's a big piece of how we need to adapt. So I'm very interested in those kinds of issues. I've also done a lot of work on negotiation, and certainly if you're talking about any kind of adaptation and policy change, there's some of the big pieces of kind of the areas. So I'm here just to see what other people are doing and kind of think about some of my interests.
Yeah. I'm Geneva Chong, and I'm a research ecologist with the Northern Rocky Mountain Science Center, which is based in Bozeman, and then I have the pleasure of working half-time with this climate science center, really just doing whatever is needed in that science project.
And last but not least, our helper B, Mary.
Yeah, so I'm a sophomore here at CSU studying environmental sociology with a minor in sustainability. I really do communication work. So I'm interested in doing nonprofit communication and climate change communication, et cetera. So I just do media and social media and the website, et cetera, for the sector.
Stuart.
Sure.
I apologize for being late. My name's Stuart Cottrell. I'm in the Department of Mention Natural Resources. Bumped into Dennis a couple of days, about a week ago, and he told me about this. And I guess my direct relationship is I'm on an NSF grant. That's what we were doing all day yesterday with an Learn like filming session together with the Colorado School of Mines to look at impacts of tree mortality from mountain pine beetle and what that means to the water cycle. So John Stednick and I at Colorado State are part of that project to help them communicate the science related about that, and so it's all funded through the water cycle climate program within NSF. So it's part of it.
Great, and Dennis, you wanted to just make some...
Just a couple of additional comments. It's just that in addition to what we're trying to do within the North Central region, that these efforts and discussions are really critical to how the U.S. Global Change Research Program defines the social science engagement. I'm on the board of Environmental Change and Society at the NRC, and we've been working with the USGCRP now recently in really trying to help them define that mission. It's difficult. They're having great difficulty of really trying to understand the manner in which they, at one hand, incorporate this research area into the agencies. And then secondly, how does the agencies really build capacity within their own ranks to really deal with these issues? And so this type of dialogue and working group, I think, will be very, very informative to that effort, and we've been, we'll be constantly working with them. Secondly, within the National Climate Assessment, there's a number of things going on, and Shannon will be talking about some of that. But in addition, to follow on to how future assessments go on, these RISA, these climate science centers are going to be part of the mechanism to feed information into it. So as we can better elucidate some of the issues that our various stakeholders are facing and how we actually can help guide strategies to help to deal with the complexities of climate change within their sectors is really critical as well. I'm involved right now co-leading an effort with the NCA on grassland rangeland indicators, and we're pushing the effort on looking at how we actually incorporate the social ecological framing of that. And so again, outcomes from this will feed into that, I think. It's an evolving thing, so it's not, a one-time shot, but using adaptive management strategies, it's a iterative process. It's a growing process. So, it's something that like Trina here will be doing 10 years from now when I'm retired. And other young people here.
You're not retiring in 10 years.
Don't get your hopes up.
So we're, it's an interesting time because right now we have the ear of the agencies, the ear of the administration, and have a couple years to make a difference, I think.
Great, thanks, Dennis. So we're going to let Rudy give about 10 minutes on what he's been up to with, he's the branch chief of the policy analysis section at USGS here at the Fort, and we're really trying as the Climate Science Center to formulate a strong partnership with these guys because obviously they've done a lot of the social science groundwork in the region, and then Rudy's part of this kind of national effort. So Dennis is going to be your timekeeper. So,
how many people listened to the talk that I gave the other day? Oh, less than. Okay, wow, okay. Good. I thought I'd just be talking to one of you. So the human dimensions of climate change, nice short names. We call it human dimensions of climate change an interagency collaborative. And so the idea was born out of the concept that natural resource management or public land agencies, there are a lot of people out there that are in the field, at the field level, all the way up to policymaking levels that are grappling with these decisions that they know they have to make that are associated with climate change and social science, but they don't really know what the questions are to ask. They don't really know where the data are to be able to answer the questions, to do all this. So we thought that we would try and come up with a group of folks that would help them in the field. And so the concept is that we want to do something that's interagency, that works across agencies, whether it's interior or agriculture, whoever it might be. We want something that functions at a practical level that's going to help people. So the field Fish and Wildlife Service refuge manager or person who's tasked with writing the social impact assessment for their CCT has to do something associated with climate change. They can get information from us or from this collaborative to be able to make that decision at that level, as well as maybe someone up on the hill who says, oh my gosh, I need to think about, climate change impacts across my agency. They can also go to this collaborative and get some information to help them make this kind of, the choices that they have to make. So we want it functional at multiple levels. I keep getting in the way of that light. So the idea is also that we want, so it's functional, it is practical, it helps decision making, it works across agencies. I'm moving a lot.
No, it's
I
okay.
could
You
just
can
hold
have it
it.
closer in your way.
So we originally wrote a proposal that went to the USGS Powell Center, which is to create a think shop of folks, get a working group of people together who are going to do something and create a project or a paper or data sets associated with it. So what we came up with this concept of getting a group of people together. That's what all of us do. This is a workshop, right? This is a collaborative. We're all trying to get people together. So we wanted to work at a couple of different levels. We want to be able to create a community practice that's out there, people who are doing this stuff. And some people will check in occasionally, the refuge manager who just needs to write their plan, and other people who are specializing in the field can stick with it for longer periods of time. We want a forum where people can communicate. So we have a group of people and a mechanism, a forum for them to be able to exchange information, ideas, data, all that kind of stuff. And I'm from New York. I always say this, that I'm exercising my right to speak really fast as a born and bred East Coaster. So I'm probably already at like 7 minutes. Right? So we want a forum. We also want to give people some concept of how to, right, some guidelines, some framework for them to be able to employ this information that we've found and brought to them. So we want them to know that, if the refuge manager, I'm just sticking with that as the same example for consistency, has to make decisions, they can go into this forum and be able to say, okay, did somebody make a decision associated with that species? Did somebody make a decision associated with this geographic context, with this level of management or something, so they can find information from various avenues to help them make their choices. So what are we doing? We right now have a group of people who are core decision makers, or a core committee we call it, who are trying to guide the project out there. This core committee, we need to hire people to physically do the work, because as you know, you get together a group of core people who are donating their time out of the generosity of their heart. They don't have time to write papers and to do things and things like that. So we need to hire some folks. So if you know any students that need jobs, let me know. I'm glad you're here to do. That's all this now. So yes, get all this down. And then we also want to make sure that there's not necessarily just buy-in, that whatever we're doing works from the ground up, that we have a lot of other people, that forum, that community of practice, who are providing input, not just data, not just examples of things, but are helping to craft the guidelines and the framework and all of that, so that they are vested in the process as well as making it real and functional for them. So we want to activities, right? I'm at like 10 minutes already, aren't I? Oh, really? Oh, okay. So, you're talking here. So where we are now, the committee has been, meeting and trying to do all this stuff. We got the paperwork, and the BLM is one of the primary intellectual and economic funders of this project right now, cost sharing a lot with USGS to do this. We have the funding to hire term employees, postdoc type person preferably, who'd be able to actually execute a lot of the work, but of course we got sequestered. I have a shutdown because of that, so we're in a stalemate. Now we're in a position to sort of not to plead for help, but it's current status where if I can hire a student, we came up with the idea that I can hire a short-term student who can actually do tasks and work and that sort of thing. That's our next step, is to continue making progress on this. Then once we have some progress and traction made with this stuff, then we can get the word out to the larger community of practice folks and say, you don't want to just gather folks and say, hey, we have this idea. You want to get out there and say, we have an idea, here's a straw man for us to start working with. So we want to get to that straw man part. We need to hire somebody to help us actually do some of the legwork to make that happen. The tasks, or where the rubber meets the road, things that we want to actually accomplish and do right now, we want to identify the key questions. What are the questions out there the public land managers are grappling with associated with climate change, human dimensions, social science, and decision making, right? So we can come up with the ideas and the concepts of problems that both the issues, questions, problems, all of those sort of things. Right? We want to do some maybe case studies, because we're thinking about how do you understand what the issues and questions are. You can do a survey, you can do a lot of things, but we thought we'd come up with some regional case studies where we can go in and identify what are the moving parts, who are the players, what are the decisions, what's the information that they have, what are the gaps in the information. So do some case studies where we pick a few places and actually dig down and see what they are, to identify the moving parts, describe the moving parts, extrapolate that information in order to help create this sort of forum and database, which one of the other big things is actually creating a database of information that's out there. So we're identifying the questions, doing some case studies, moving parts, describing the phenomena that we're observing, and creating an actual forum of database web applications that will house data and house case studies and house examples of things. And that's the actual interactive, searchable forum that anybody, not just public land managers, will be able to log into this thing. And so the refuge manager can say, climate change issues, public engagement, whatever species, or coastal environment, or whatever it might be. That's where we need someone to help ferret out how this thing's going to work. But we want something functional where somebody can actually, that's a face where people are going to see this. And then, of course, any good effort doesn't finish without publications. We want to write some guidelines and principle kind of documents. Something that's, not necessarily an exact how-to, but a little bit of a cookbook maybe, or an a la carte menu, similar to the principles and guidelines of social impact assessments that we all know and love, that sort of gives folks an idea of what are the things that we need to consider, how do we go about considering those things, and it's actually something published that's refereed that they can use in perpetuity. Pronounced that correctly, that's got to be out there. Questions? Oh, I didn't give credit where credit's due. Again, BLM, Fish and Wildlife Service, National Park Service, Department of Interior, Bureau of Ocean Energy Management. We have a team of folks that are really helping out with this.
Where do the LPPs or the CSCs, they fall? They have to table this, or they kind of
They're not fully engaged yet. If you remember from the presentation, I had the page up there that said make it relevant to all the players. And so that's where we're working with how, when you identify a case study area, you have rapid ecological assessments, you have LCCs, you have climate science centers, you have parks, you have forests, you have BLM units, you have refuges. So we have GIS maps with all that stuff on it. And so the idea is, we go and, well, actually, we only have one map for Alaska right now. But landowners, so that's how we're working. We're trying to identify who these places are. So that's where it's like your case study, perfect. So
Which one? Alaska?
No, the one that you just started doing. You put up a slide the other day
For the Yampa Way.
of this area here, right?
Oh,
And that's how we're going to go. We have BLM people who are heavily vested in the rapid ecological assessment. Karen Lake needs is part of that. So we're considering that, and once we launch, all those people are at the table once we're there.
So do you say more about the membership of your advisory committee? One is from them. You didn't call it that, whatever it was.
So,
we have a slide on here.
The current committee, and if folks really want to join in, please sign up. Yeah, this is a group of the people that are on the phone right now. Not right this month.
Not now.
Big figure. Every second or first and third Tuesday at 9 o'clock Mountain Time. These are the folks who are getting on the phone and talking about this right now. And so we can add to this right here. We can, if folks are interested, that second group, because then the idea is that this is just sort of the start. Again, we have no intention of taking it miles and miles down the road. The idea is then once we get on the ground and get some traction, then we engage that middle group of folks who are hopefully going to be the ones that can, when it comes time to publish something, someone will say, okay, this is my section, I can help draft this part. Or, that's where we engage with folks who are actually going to hit the road and help do a lot of those things. So
that group's limited then to federal employees and federal folks? I'm just trying to figure out what you're saying.
It's not limited necessarily. When this project was originally conceptualized by Rob Winthrop and myself and a small group of folks who put this proposal together, we jokingly now, tongue-in-cheek, say we limited ourselves to public land and federal management agencies to sort of limit the scope of the project, which is a joke because yeah, right. I mean, and by no means, the concept of academics and non-governmental agencies, heavy players, a lot of the data, a lot of the information, a lot of those cases are going to come from non-governmental institutions, so not limited by any means.
Great, thanks, Rudy.
Do you have a website or something like that?
Not yet.
Not yet.
I can email, if you have this list, I can email the fact sheet, which is just a one-pager.
Okay.
It's just a one-pager. I'll get that out to Laura. I was going to bring hard copies, but I thought, let's do it electronically. Because everyone's going to stick it in their bag and forget about it. Late in the day, I was tired.
Okay.
I have one question.
Yeah.
How large of an area are you talking about when you say case studies? Are you
So
mentioned like
for
ecoregions
a
or
case,
states?
that's one of the big questions to be grappled with. We have the multi-criteria decision matrix, we jokingly called it, which is an Excel spreadsheet with a whole bunch of things that you should consider when potentially choosing a case study. So the first location was Alaska, someplace in Alaska. Okay, so then you do the North Slope, do you do, a smaller section, so that's where we get into LCCs, rapid ecological assessments, and then you start looking at, well, what are the jurisdictions that are in an area, and how do you go about overlapping and choosing of, you don't have to do that.
It's pretty
So that's one of the issues. How do you put a circle on a map and call that the location for the case study? That's like step one of case study creation. And we got to the creation of a map for Alaska with property with boundaries, land ownership and various boundaries so far, and a multi-decision criteria matrix.
All right, we're going to have a lot more time for discussion as the day goes on, so thank you, Rudy.
Yeah.
I'm going to go ahead and get started with my portion of the agenda. So just to give you a little bit of an update on the working group. So far we have about 43 people who have asked to participate in some way or another in the group, and they're an interdisciplinary mix of researchers from federal agencies and our university consortium. So we had our first conference call in January. We've had 2 subsequent webinars, Olga Wilhelmi from NCAR on an integrated vulnerability and adaptive capacity framework, and then Leslie Richardson from Rudy's group, USGS, the policy analysis group, on the ASPEN tool, which is assessing socioeconomic planning needs. We're recording everything, and we're going to have everything on the website. So this week, Wednesday, we had our first really face-to-face meeting, plus virtual participation at the National Adaptation Forum in Denver. Hi, Bob Goff, welcome. We had actually more participants than I expected. We had 22 total in addition to Dennis and I, so 24 with us, 14 of whom were in person and 8 joined virtually. Several presentations. I presented my water resource management in the context of climate vulnerability and change case in the White Basins region. Betsy Neely presented on her Gunnison Basin work, and then we had a couple other quick talks from people about their work. Rudy and Dan Williams and Lisa Dilling. Dan and Lisa are both going to present more on their work today. Bob Goff presented some stuff on tribal issues. And so some of what I'm presenting today is going to be what I spoke about at that forum, but there I presented on the National Climate Assessment Adaptation chapter as well as my own research, which I'm actually not going to present on either of those today. I'm just going to touch on the NCA briefly. What I'm focusing on today is more kind of the analytical and intellectual landscape, so to speak, of doing this kind of integrated social ecological vulnerability adaptation assessment. So first, the process, the full adaptation process. This was our graphic in our paper on the technical inputs from the adaptation chapter of the National Climate Assessment. At the National Adaptation Forum this week, we saw a mind-numbing amount of frameworks and methods and tools, but they all pretty much follow this basic, general process. Starting at the top really with identifying risks and vulnerabilities, moving into planning, assessing and selecting options, implementation, monitor evaluation, revise, revisit, rinse, repeat, whatever. In the adaptation chapter, the review of the technical inputs, what we found is there's a lot going on in this country here and here, but it kind of stops here with the planning. There's not so much into this implementation phase, especially in the conservation ecosystems sector. I would say that sector we had the hardest time actually finding on-the-ground implementation. So that is a good justification for what we're doing here, because a a lot of what underpins that gap are social issues and social science questions. So this framework is also very similar to the Scanning the Horizons process, which is in our kind of foundational documentation for the National Climate Center. And what I'm really going to talk about today is primarily this section, which is the assessing vulnerability to climate change, focusing on, what do we mean from a social perspective when we talk about exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity from a social science perspective. And again, this is really about the process. And what we're trying to do with this working group is not only integrate them, but really understand how you complete this cycle successfully. That's the trick. And that's where I think a lot of the social science insights can help with what we're all trying to do collectively. So there's a lot of literature in the vulnerability and adaptation side of, especially the social side, that talk about these different approaches to understanding how you get to climate policy and management. The top-down approach, which really is kind of the modeling physical science approach, where you sort of start with these big issues, and you move this chair, and get to vulnerability as sort of an outcome, physical vulnerability. This bottom-up approach is really more where I live, which is really working with communities, understanding all of these complicated social issues, social ecological issues, adaptive capacities, and then you get to the social vulnerability. And this kind of local, regional scale is really where a lot of adaptation actually happens. And so one of the sort of foundational approaches that I and a lot of my colleagues use comes from the Smith and Wandel 2006 paper, which is really about two things primarily. One is the importance of the participatory approach in understanding social ecological vulnerability and adaptive capacity. And then second to that is a corollary of that really is that one, you help identify vulnerability with people who are vulnerable themselves. And you really start here with current exposures and sensitivities and current adaptive capacities and strategies. That provides the baseline until you get here. And a lot of that top-down research starts the other way. And really the power is in sort of integrating both of these approaches. But when you're working with stakeholders, that understanding historical and current baseline vulnerability is really critical. This is another kind of highly referenced and used framework originally from the Billy Turner et al. 2003 paper, and more recently sort of made into this lovelier, less complicated diagram from Sunwa et al. In Global Environmental Change. And again, really what we're trying to do here is understand, especially, exposure is really primarily about the climate variables. But sensitivity and adaptive capacity for human systems requires a different approach than just focusing on ecosystems, just focusing on the vulnerability and adaptive capacities of species, habitat, and ecosystems, which is really what that Scanning the Horizons framework is about. And so we're trying to bring back in that sort of broader social component to that. So I presented this the other day. I think it's worth talking about again, which is as far as the analysis part goes. So Jeff, you brought up that this part isn't cyclical, like the Scanning the Horizons document, and that's true. But the analysis still really philosophically comes more from this side of things, which is, you understand your climate, your exposure unit, you try and understand the ecosystem responses, and then you have your kind of outcome vulnerability. Whereas from a social science perspective and a more integrated perspective, we kind of start here, which is understanding these dynamic institutional, socioeconomic, and technological dynamics in concert with the biophysical. And then that gets you to that understanding of social ecological systems. And then this is from that same paper, which I encourage you guys, I know it's kind of overwhelming to try and take in right now, but I really like this table because I think Karen O'Brien is a top-notch scholar in the field, and I think that they really outlined well sort of how you think about these different approaches, and really, I think where we are as the LCC and CSC community is we're kind of at least trying to be here in the middle. which is understanding multiple stressors, understanding the institutional context and dynamics that either facilitate adaptation or provide barriers for adaptation, indicator approaches, agent-based modeling, capacity building, and adaptive management. So this is really kind of that sweet spot in the middle that we're all sort of trying to converge around. So, given that, a lot of agencies especially don't always have the time to do a full-blown vulnerability and adaptation assessment, I pulled out some stuff from Netwater in terms of just the sort of basic questions you think about when you're trying to do this integrated, rapid vulnerability assessment. So some of those include who, what, when, and where are the exposure units. So that has to do with timing and seasonality, at what scale, what climate hazards and stresses are they exposed to, how resilient are the exposure units to current stresses, what's been the impact of historical episodes such as droughts and floods, are those stresses changing and how, and what kind of indicators capture current and future vulnerability. And then the questions about adaptive capacity. What kind of adaptive capacities do they have? What are the barriers to realizing those capacities? How can the barriers be overcome? And what opportunities exist to build capacity and the ability to actually utilize that capacity? So a lot of the literature sort of centers around these concepts that I collated in this table in terms of the determinants of adaptive capacity. And they really oftentimes break it down into these capital assets, which include human assets. I won't go into details about these, but a lot of you, I'm sure, have seen similar concepts around this table because it's sort of adapted from multiple sources. But these are really kind of the primary determinants that we talk about for adaptive capacity, which also includes natural capital and ecosystem services. So again, really trying to understand that human-environment connection. A lot of this comes from the livelihoods approach, which came out of a lot of the development literature. And so this is, again, a complicated, messy diagram, but if you're not familiar with this literature, it gives you some kind of exposure to all of the different ways we think about social systems in their environmental context and how they're really vulnerable to and dependent on these various capacities and livelihoods, resources and strategies to be able to adapt to climate change. So, another approach that I think is really useful in understanding. Bob Goff, you are totally interrupting my presentation. Sit yourself down.
I haven't said a word.
So another approach that I think is really helpful to think about is in the context of what we're doing here is understanding the decision space. So, not just understanding this livelihoods context and the social ecological system, but understanding the decision space in which managers and policymakers have either the opportunities or the barriers, the capacities or the strategies to be able to adapt to climate change. So just to kind of summarize and put into some buckets the types of approaches that I have sort of identified. I started in October, and I've been really trying to assess what people are doing and what kind of needs are out there, and just start to sort of, in my own mind, kind of bin these different types of approaches that I think are useful for us to think about as we're trying to build capacity for this research in the region. So the first is this, social ecological systems, vulnerability, and adaptive capacity based on livelihood. So that's really trying to understand the full system as a whole that isn't just focused on species, habitat, ecosystems, but includes humans and how they're collectively vulnerable and can respond to environmental change. The other one that I think is really useful to the kinds of things that I've been hearing from the agencies especially is really the understanding of, public stakeholders, policymakers, planners, and knowledge, their risk perceptions, and their behaviors. Because, you know, the thing that sets us apart from the rest of the animal kingdom is our capacity for abstraction, for symbolism, and for emotion. And those actually determine a lot of what we do as managers, as decision makers, as researchers. And so really kind of understanding those aspects that go into decision making are, I think, fundamentally important. And then this idea of multi-jurisdictional governance, the institutional dynamics, and how that plays a role in collaborative and collective natural resource management. And there's a lot of, you know, these are all areas of research that there's a lot out there. Again, as Dennis alluded to in the beginning, it's really a matter of how do we best think about how to integrate these approaches and integrate these perspectives so that we can work across disciplines and across agencies and across scales of governance. And then lastly, this area of kind of decision analysis, and certainly these aren't mutually exclusive, they overlap in some are parts of others, but again, just to kind of try and put a little bit of structure on these different types of research that can really benefit from this approach. And within this type of research, there's already stuff going on out there in terms of scenario planning, adaptive management, and then really, you know, examining the capacity and the strategies that managers have by understanding their existing planning processes. So some of the stuff that Nikki mentioned you're doing, you know, I think it's going to be fundamentally important for us as we're trying to figure out how to work with and support federal land managers, especially to understand some of these existing planning processes and management processes. So I just put a couple examples up here: the Fish and Wildlife Service Comprehensive Conservation Plan, and the BLM, or the National Park Service Resource Management Plan. So as I mentioned earlier, one of the things we're doing as a center, and one of the things I'm personally trying to do, is really start by synthesizing what's going on in the region. One of the first tenets of our center is not to reinvent the wheel. So really trying to take stock. And so this is an interactive GIS map, and I have the PDF we can turn on and off layers. But so far I've put 10 of the projects in here, several of which we either heard about on Wednesday or we're going to hear more about today. But really trying to, you know, take stock and synthesize what's out there. And I personally would like to for us to think about a publication on this that might sort of provide this synthesis for vulnerabilities and capacities in the research in the region. So in summary, sort of some questions for us to think about today.
Wow. This must be important.
So the first one, how do we effectively bridge these intellectual research frameworks and approaches across the social sciences, the ecological sciences, the climate sciences, and, you know, it's no small feat. We're certainly not the only ones trying to do it, but how can we do it in the most effective way that we can? The other, of course, is for our region, what should our research priorities be? I think as a collective, as a group, we're in the process of taking stock. We want to kind of identify, okay, what do we have, and where are the gaps, and what do we need to do to fill those gaps? Then the process part of that. So what's our process as a regional network of practice? How best can we keep this momentum going that we've started today, on Wednesday and today, over time and into the future, so that we are best communicating and supporting each other, and that we as the Climate Science Center can help facilitate all of you and what you're doing. And then number 4, I think, is really, really important for us to keep at the forefront of our mind, which is how do we effectively bridge the research to the managers and the practitioners? Not surprisingly, we're all researchers in this group. We've got some federal agency representation. We actually lost. We were going to have someone from Fish and Wildlife. We were going to have someone from BLM. We lost both of them. We've got Forest Service. We've got Park Service. We've got USGS. Who am I missing? I think that's the agency representation here. So we've got this interagency issue, but then we've also got the issue that managers don't tend to think like we do. And in fact, exactly. Well, that's implied. And in fact, a lot of those issues I talked about in terms of, worldviews and risk perceptions and knowledge really come into play with that. Because we have to do research in a way that we're trying to do the best science, but we're understanding that the rest of the world doesn't think the way we do, and so how do we best provide the research capacity and the outcomes for society and federal managers in particular to make better decisions. And then from a practical perspective for us today, and I think this is what we're going to do in our facilitated discussion after the speakers go, is really try and identify some shared goals, milestones, and measures for our success. That's all I have to say, and I'm actually a minute ahead of time. I cannot believe it. That never happened.
I'll take credit for it.
But I think, there's a lot of things that we, these questions and some of the things that you've illustrated really does frame what we can do. I think this issue, though, of bridging, I think we should always think about research and management. It's not research to managers. It's actually think about co-development throughout this effort.
Right.
And even though it might be implied, it really needs to be explicit.
Absolutely. I'm glad you said that because I meant to point out that number 4, that bridging effectively to managers, is both an intellectual question and a process question, and on multiple scales. And as again, sort of a practical matter, how do we as a group not be doing something in parallel that's not connected? And as the Climate Science Center, our solicitation that's out right now really tries to make sure that these things are happening together, that they're not happening separately from each other and potentially conflicting with each other.
And then one other thing that is emerging in the sort of the research field is sort of and it's something that Gary Yo has put forward as risk framing. And that's something that I'm still trying to ingest that and try to figure out.
It's funny you said that because I had an extra slide in case someone was going to bring that up that has the risk assessment there.
Because that risk framing is actually a useful way of actually looking at these problems in a socio-ecological context.
Well, that's a good point because that's what brings people's attention to the issue.
Right.
Risk framing.
And so whether or not we want to take that on as a research aspect or not, beyond what we're doing, sort of not traditionally, but the way that we're actually doing things, do we want to incorporate that and actually understand what we mean by risk framing across these different sectors? And that's I think a very important research question. I don't know exactly how to approach it, but I think it's something that's worthwhile talking about or thinking about later on today.
So I had this in an earlier version of this presentation. This is kind of one way to think about how you connect, the social vulnerability part with the biophysical vulnerability part. Up at the top is that general framing of exposure sensitivity, adaptive capacity, and then this is kind of a typical risk framing of likelihood, consequence, et cetera, and then equals climate risk. I would argue that that's one way to think about how you do risk framing. There is a lot of literature out there in terms of why this isn't such a neat equation as it's presented here. And, all the different ways to think about risk and risk assessment and risk perceptions and risk framing. And that's, obviously a lot of that comes out of the social sciences. So, but just to kind of give one, at least, conceptualization of how people are thinking about this connection to risk. And then, of course, there's the iterative risk management approach. It's a whole other story. So...
Bill, you're involved in this stuff.
And we naturally tend to think of risk as the down of the events of the thing.
Right.
The risk framing, and Gary's work all along has been about framing. So it's a different way of asking people to think about.
Exactly.
That's why it's a good question, not a done deal yet.
That's right. Absolutely.
That's right. There's no problem with thinking about risk and having people think about the events and thresholds and what you're sensitive to, but a risk framing of those, quote, they risks, is a different matter from research assessment.
Right. And they talk about this actually in the decision support chapter of the National Climate Assessment, and I think they did a pretty decent job at getting.
The British one has a whole document out on the risk framing approach.
So which one?
The UK climate program.
The UK SIP? Mm-hmm.
It's pretty well thought out. And
those guys are good.
Yeah, if anybody, don't know if
the SAP on risk for the earlier.
That's right. 2008.
Yeah, and it's pretty useful too.
Yeah, UK SIP, if people haven't heard of it, is just Google UK SIP. That's a really good resource for a lot of this type of work, particularly working with the national government, in governments, I should say, in the UK on trying to integrate adaptation, more of this type of an adaptation approach with, I'm still talking, with more of the top-down kind of assessment.
Just a quick question, maybe to park for the later time when we have discussion time on the agenda, but on your list of questions, there's a lot of like we and our and so on. I would like to know more about the practical, like, okay, so if we outline some strategies or some things to do, who is the we? What are the mechanisms we have to do new things, or is it redirecting existing things? Like, what are the who's the we in the list of questions, and what's practical? You know, is it just at this meeting, to get these people together today and then try and think like, what could we do going out or thinking about going out? So.
Who's the we, and what was that?
Just a comment on the risk framing sort of piece.
Just the we and the practical, what mechanisms are available to move forward with whatever things we do start on that list, or you want to start on that list. Again, whoever the we is. Maybe all you.
At one of the National Climate Assessment Town Halls, it was the Southwest Town Hall, and it was presenting some of it wasn't just the Southwest focused research, but it was for the general chapters as well. And this idea of risk framing came up, and people, the users, I will say the user, stakeholder community in the audience have a lot to say about the risk framing as outlined in the National Climate Assessment, because it was very much that's an academic approach. That's not the way we do things. So
exactly.
To the extent that we are, this risk-based framing has been such an underlying concept of the National Climate Assessment as it's emerging, that I think there's still a dialogue about how to approach it. So I would encourage us to explore this, but also keeping in mind that our approach would be different than the user community.
Yeah, and Kristen, in fact, for the adaptation chapter, we pretty much threw it out. We're like, this just doesn't work for us, because it was kind of that, it was kind of just started here. It was like, what's the likelihood, probability, consequence? And what's your justification for that? And we're like, we're the adaptation chapter. We don't play that.
Just a quick comment back to your 5 statements there. That's why I think question number 4 is a priority question, because I think a lot of others are descriptive. We can kind of do an assessment of what everybody's doing. You can have that. That's the easy part. To talk amongst us, but what I'm doing for the project, how to communicate hydrology and effects on water quality. The public wants to know, and there's a big disjoint just in terminology. That's why that's such.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah,
John Gross had his hand up all the whole time, so I got to call on him.
Just want to do a direct comment, some of which has already been said, but coming from the management perspective, there's a paper that kind of compares the risking framework to the vulnerability assessment. It's Romeo or something, I don't know how you pronounce his name at all, 2010 I think it is. And he makes a couple of comparisons and says that at least in the traditional risk framing, which we use a lot in the Park Service because we have a whole environmental quality branch that relates to that for ships running into coral reefs and, lots of legal cases. But he points out that in the traditional risk framing assessment, a lot of the risks are point events. They're hurricanes or floods or, kind of acute events that occur at a time and a place. And for climate change, and also they're based then a lot on statistical probabilities of the past. Where there is a record of observations, and there are statistical tests, and there are legal frameworks, whereas in the climate change environment, we're mostly working with projections. We're also working with a lot of events that in the ecological literature might be called press events. So they're kind of gradual things that are occurring, and ecologists have been woefully unable to predict where thresholds occur in the future. We're fairly good at seeing some of them in the past. You know, a lake goes from clear to, you know, full of algae. But I think that discussion, given that we have a few people who I think are, you know, pretty much recognized as experts in risk, it would be really useful for those of us in the management community where, as you said, this idea of putting these probabilities and these complicated models out there is just a non-starter in a lot of the management context. Try and engage with some of you and say, this is how, when we talk with our managers, they're perceiving these things here. And I'm not concerned about coming up with an explicit framework, but just how could we take the things that we've learned from decades of working in the risk assessment environment and apply them to this very new, emerging, and, you know, kind of primitive field of vulnerability assessment. That seems like the nexus where this group could potentially really contribute. But I think we haven't done, I mean, that joint, people are recognizing we need to do it, but to my knowledge, at least, nobody's really kind of nailed that one yet.
Yep. We need to move on. So the next speaker is Cody Kniston, who came down from Rapid City, South Dakota. He's with the National Drought Mitigation Center at University of Nebraska-Lincoln, but based at Arrows, right?
No, other side of the state, in Rapid City.
But what's the, I thought you were in Arrows. Where are you?
No, I just work at home.
I thought you were
field office.
I thought you were in Arrows. Didn't even, yeah.
I just on the phone and.
There's two people produced. We didn't let introductions. It looks like there's two people.
Who's on the phone?
This is Becky Cato at Denver Botanic Gardens.
Oh, hi. Thanks for joining us. Becky,
And I'm here. This is Heather Lazarus.
Hey, Heather.
Hey.
I can encourage our speakers to actually leave some time for comments. So when you see the 2 minutes, or when you see the 5-minute sign go up, actually start wrapping up, so that I think there's a lot of rich discussion that we really want to get into. So not to rush you, but sort of we're behind 20 minutes now, and so, but these discussions are really the critical.
But we've got some flexibility because we were going to have a facilitated discussion after the talks, and we've already kind of started that. So
yeah, I want to continue that.
I gave them 15 minutes.
Well, I'll try to keep it short. Mine's a little long,
minutes.
but I'll try to keep it short here.
Yeah.
Today I'm just going to give you a little bit of an overview of what we do at the National Drought Mitigation Center. Again, we're in the School of Natural Resources at the University of Nebraska in Lincoln. And, you know, we haven't done a lot of work on the ecological side, but we have worked with a lot of stakeholders in the north central region on drought issues. Since we're the drought center, we're getting more into climate change issues because people are calling for that. And a lot of the research is going that direction. But we have worked quite a bit on water issues and land management issues. And so I'm going to talk about kind of like I said, a general overview of the projects. I'm kind of throwing the kitchen sink at you, just to give you an idea of the range of projects we work on. And maybe some of these might be applicable to some of the work you think of doing where we are in the region. And I wanted to note, too, that a lot of our work is pretty applied. We call ourselves an end-to-end organization, and as a boundary organization. We do a lot of work going out and asking people what they think about things, what they need, and then try to develop the tools and information to meet those needs. So we do some basic research all the way out to developing products, making them operational, doing outreach and education on those products as well. Now, some of the things you think of the National Drought Mitigation Center, these are more of the drought monitoring and impact monitoring things that we do. And these are some more of our visible projects, like the U.S. Drought Monitor up there on the left, a weekly snapshot of drought conditions across the country. We're one of the collaborators to help put that together. We're just about to release a drought risk atlas. That's going back to the early 1900s. So it's a national product, so you can go back and see the extent of droughts for your region, the intensity, how long they lasted, all those, and the return intervals, probabilities. And that'll be released probably in the next month or so. We also developed some monitoring tools like the Vegetation Drought Response Index to monitor vegetation conditions due to stress or drought stress across the country. And we also try to monitor impacts of drought. Again, this is a national product, And we have a automated news clipping service that sends us news stories every day. We get thousands of those every day. We have somebody whose full-time job is to go through these stories and pull out and see what's happening across the country, give a sample of these on there. We also look at extension reports, government reports about impacts, and draw on volunteer networks like the Cocoa Rods, weather monitors. They can submit impacts as well. So just kind of keeping tabs on what's going on. This is more about exposure to droughts and some of the potential impacts of drought. But then, and that's handled by our drought monitoring program area. We also have a planning and social science program area. And we're the folks who actually go out and talk to people to better understand how they're affected by drought and climate change now more and more that we're talking about, and what they're doing to deal with it and how we can help them. And we've done a lot of work in the North Central region. Trying to think back to the projects we've worked on. We've mainly worked with farmers, ranchers, done some work now recently with communities. We've worked on a watershed scale and done quite a bit of work with states. We're also just starting to work with tribes a little bit more. We've worked more with them in the Southwest. Now we're starting to work a little bit more with them, with Bob and others up in the North Central region. But now just kind of going through a few of the projects, and I'm not going to be able to discuss all the results of the projects, but just to tell you a little bit about what we've done or what we are doing. And this is one, sustainable adaptations to drought and climate variability in ag production systems across Nebraska. This was from 2004 to 2006, a NOAA-funded study, worked with other UNL collaborators. We started hearing about, in the sustainable ag literature, that they were more drought resilient than traditional producers, and holistic ranchers were more resilient to drought, so we wanted to go out there and talk to them about that, and ask them why they thought they might be more resilient. So we asked them through a mail survey. We surveyed membership of the Sustainable Ag Society in Nebraska, the Organic Crop Improvement Society, the Holistic Ranch group. There used to be one in Nebraska that had a mailing list. And so we did a mail survey of them, and we also went out and did 48 face-to-face interviews with them, asking them about how their operations are affected by drought, why they think they're more resilient than more traditional operators, if they could give us some idea of how to prove that, what data could we use. And we also asked them about their response adaptation strategies that they had implemented on their farms and ranches, if they use weather and climate information, barriers to using that information, and so those are the sorts of questions that we asked that group in particular. And if you want to know the results, I've got a copy of the paper back here, but it was published in the Journal of Renewable Ag and Food Systems. Okay. We did the same thing when we were doing those interviews. A lot of the farmers said that, sustainable farmers especially, said we're kind of doing things right now. We don't see a lot of opportunities to change, or we can't because of organics can't change their systems and things very easily. But the ranchers were really interested in the topic because they can't sell cattle. They don't want to sell cattle and buy them back really quickly. They want to try to get in a balance with nature a little bit more. And so we really started focusing now for the last decade on ranchers in the Great Plains. And so we're working with South Dakota State University, UNL Extension, NRCS. We've gone out and done interviews with ranchers and advisors. Again, we targeted ones that had developed drought plans to see what they had done, because those are kind of hard to come by. Asking them about their plans, how they put them together, recommendations for others doing the same thing. We put together a ranch planning website for that, along with a few journal articles. Again, looking at ranchers and how they're affected by drought and trying to adapt to droughts and planning. This is a larger project led by Linda Stocker-Prokope at Purdue University. And this was going out and looking at corn producers and asking them about their use of climate information now, their climate change concerns, what they're thinking of doing, what they're doing now in terms of management, and what they could for climate change. And again, this was a larger one. This was a 5-year project that's still ongoing. 9 universities in 8 states across the Midwest, across the Corn Belt. This is the project area. We're looking at mainly the dark green areas, the major corn growing areas. And we've got a team of modelers. They're the ones that are going out and looking at the climate change projections, trying to downscale those, and attaching those to economic models, crop yield models, to see how climate in the past has affected crop yields, for example, and then we're trying to project that into the future to see how different scenarios could affect crop yields, and then looking at different management. If they planted different crops, how would that affect yields and costs and all of that? If they use different land management strategies, how would that affect it? You've got the modelers working on that. And then you've got the social scientists doing the surveys. Let's get across a little bit about the modeling. But the producer surveys, we surveyed about 19,000 farmers across the Corn Belt, and we did it by watershed, which is a little bit different because we thought most of the decisions are going to be made on a watershed basis. We did it by watershed. And then we followed that up. Well, we did first the producer survey. We did an advisor survey in pilot states that we had better contacts with. We didn't have easy lists of those. And so, again, a lot of those questions we're getting back to the timing of their decisions, what kind of climate information are they using, what threats do they see from climate change, and who should be doing what in terms of management, and who are they talking to. So if we develop new tools and products based on all this information, who should we target to disseminate that information to? And again, 2 brand new publications have come out in the last couple months on those. I've got copies of those in the back, and I can talk about those too. I'm just going to quickly say something about this. We've been looking at decadal climate variability in the Missouri River Basin in general. And what I mean by that is how the effects of sea surface temperature on rainfall and temperature out here in the basin, and looking at basically long-term droughts and floods. So because sea surface temperatures don't change that quickly, most of them anyway, and so they can cause longer-term fluctuations in temperature and precipitation out here. We've got some modelers again that are trying to get those correlations between sea surface temperatures and our rainfall and temperature out here, and doing that. So in these projects, they look backwards. They look back to the 50s and the 80s droughts and the 90s, and they tried to correlate those with the way the sea surface temperatures were. And we held several workshops around the basin, asking different stakeholder groups if we could better model these and give them projections of what these, say in the next 5 to 10 years, what the sea surface temperatures could be doing, how that could affect precipitation and temperature out here in the terms of long-term dry periods and wet periods, if they could use that information. So we held lots of workshops. Now we're doing a basin-wide survey of community water systems, asking them make sure that the work out of the workshops is applicable to, say, for example, water systems in general. We looked at some of the workshops were pretty broad. We looked at natural resources, ag, water folks brought them all together. Then we focused 3 of the workshops just on water systems. There's over 2,000 water systems in the basin. And so we worked with developing case studies of Kansas City, Great Falls, Montana, Lincoln, Nebraska, looking at how long-term droughts and floods affect those communities in the past, and then how they could potentially use this information. And then now we're doing the basin-wide survey of about 700 systems. There's several publications on that too. Now there's a bigger project. I'm just going to go over this. This is a pretty good one here for climate change too. We're working with Texas A&M University now, expanding on what we did on decadal climate variability. Now we're bringing in even more modelers, not just looking at climate and crop yields and water, but they're also they're bringing in Dr. Srini Vasan from Texas A&M who developed the SWAP model. We brought in Bruce McCarl, who has the economic models for Texas. And so we're bringing in the climate models, the economic models, the hydrologic models, all of these together to see how these sea surface, or what they're doing first is they're looking at these global circulation models and if they work very well in the basin. There hasn't been a lot of work on that done. And then with that understanding, here's kind of a flow chart if you want to see it, but they're looking at the global circulation models, seeing if they worked in the past, then they can calibrate those and project those out into the future. They can add on and then they can downscale it to get high resolution data to plug into their hydrologic models, their economic models. And then we're going to work with in a watershed. They're doing that on the Missouri River Basin as a whole, and to see how in the future what could be some different scenarios for stream flows, for crop yields, for example. Then we're going to work with stakeholders in one watershed And we're thinking of, there's been a lot of interest in Montana, the Golden Triangle area. We're going to pick a watershed, not sure what size yet, and go up there and work with the stakeholders. If you're bringing, we get the high resolution data, we can go in there and ask them, what kind of changes could you potentially make to your systems? Which ones would be in your realm of possibilities? And we can model those and see what kind of, do some scenarios and see what kind of, what effects on stream flows, crop yields, and economics would be in that one watershed. I'm just going to skip to the end here. There's also been some research or more activity. We've worked with states on the state drought planning side, especially Colorado, Nebraska, South Dakota, Montana. The new trend now, a lot of the states had drought response strategies, which they just had plans of what to do during the drought. The states in orange here are the ones who are thinking of coming up with plans of what to do before drought to make them more resilient to it, in addition to the response plan. And South Dakota is up still in green, but it's working on one right now. And most of these have followed this 10-step drought planning process. A lot of the work when it comes to vulnerability assessment is in step 5 in developing your plans. And in the past, a lot of them, the plans have just focused on had a monitoring system, then they had some response actions. Now more of them with this mitigation, they're starting to look at early warning, vulnerability assessment, mitigation. Some like Nebraska, in terms of methods, just sat around a table. They didn't have a lot of time to put this together. They brought stakeholders together. They sat around the table and said, what are our vulnerable sectors? They divided up into 2 groups.
That's language.
Yeah. They divided it into 2 groups. They had an ag and natural resources group, and then they had this municipal water supply and energy subcommittee. I was on this one. And then they sat around the table and said, okay, what are all the impacts of drought in Nebraska? And they came up with a list. They ranked them as the most important ones, and then they developed strategies for each of these actions. They talk about transitioning to practitioners. I mean, this is some of the things they're doing. We tell them to do the full vulnerability assessments is the best way to do it. Look for what causes the vulnerability, why are the impacts occurring, and sometimes they just don't have the resources to do that. This is what they did in Nebraska. But in Colorado, they hired AMEC Consulting to do their vulnerability assessment. They put a lot of work into it and a lot of research into it. They actually came up with a lot of maps for a lot of different sectors, ranking vulnerability, methodology. They came up with scores for each one through a pretty complicated process that was inspired by Montaigne and Steinemann's publication. Ann Steinemann used to be at the University of Washington, and which came up with the idea of, in the past, a lot of vulnerability research has been qualitative. And now they're trying to get more into quantitative, and she gave an approach to do that, and bringing in stakeholder perceptions and things to do that. And so Colorado took off with that, and they came up with lots of different maps. This, for example, was for state assets, state-owned aquatic habitat inventory and impact scores. So the ones in these circles here are the counties that have the highest number of in-stream flow rights and fish hatcheries. And then the darker, the red color, are the ones with the junior water rights. But they thought those would be the most vulnerable. They came up with metrics to measure these vulnerabilities and map them out. So this is probably, in terms of state drought planning, is probably the most complex, the most data-driven drought plan out there.
Where did mental anguish show up?
Yeah, on their social side. And, well, that's one of the things, I don't know that they mapped social anguish, just because it's really, and that's what I put up here, right here, it's really tough to come up with those vulnerability metrics.
Yep.
What's your measure of mental anguish out there and to put it on a map?
You can overlay it with the voting legalized marijuana.
I think if you're not already, there's lots of work that's been done on drought and mental health in Australia that we should connect with. And
Australia's been doing great work on social issues and drought. Even Canada has.
Got it's a National Centre for Epidemiology and Population Health got a climate change program. Look at stuff that they've been doing to start to see.
So
I'll wrap up. So,
okay.
yeah, so we're doing a broad range of projects. We've done a lot of qualitative stuff in the past. We're trying to get more into the quantitative analysis and the bigger projects and bringing in more modelers, because that's kind of the direction of the research is taking it to. A lot of it's been a little bit sporadic and chasing grant dollars a lot. We come up with a project here. And it's great. I just think it's great to come up with some of the overall vulnerability assessment, we can come to some a little more direction in that area and longevity to keep these things going.
All right, so thank you, Cody. So just to review how we're going through these morning sessions, I'm going to ask everyone to hold your questions and comments right now, because the way we structured the agenda was to have these kind of pretty rapid back-to-back talks, and then we have over an hour in the agenda after they're done to sort of talk about them in their entirety, and then also during the coffee break, during the lunch break, you have time to ask the speakers any, individual questions. But we really want to sort of be looking at this as a collective and reflecting on that together. So our next speaker is Dan Williams from Forest Service.
Put the pressure on.
You can do it.
I should have brought my glasses.
Yeah, so we're a little behind break, but that's okay. We can, like I said, we've got cushion time in the facilitated discussion, but if you guys could try and keep it to 15 minutes like I asked you, that would be really helpful to keep us somewhat on time. Don't touch that thing up there.
I didn't bring my glasses, I didn't bring my glasses up here, so sorry for me. I'm just going to go. Okay. So, Shannon asked me to give a bit of an overview of what we've been doing in the Forest Service, and particularly with respect to the North Central region. I have a little bit of a mental difficulty because I spent most of my time in the North Central part of the Forest Service when I was a grad student. Anyway, so I have a little problem with what is the North Central. But so yeah, how to make this real quick. Anyway, Karina's back here. There's a group of us working specifically on an iterative scenario building process that we use to look at social vulnerability and adaptive capacity. We have 2 case studies that are in the North Central region, but we want to work beyond that. But I did take these 4 sort of suggested questions here. What's the geographic and sectoral scope of our project? What are the primary research questions? What are the approaches and frameworks, and some initial impressions. And so I'm going to try to do that. It's a bit of a modification of what I presented on Wednesday in the afternoon. I don't know how many people were at maybe a couple of you caught what I said, I don't know. So like Rudy was sort of saying, maybe I'm speaking to the same people over again. But this will be structured a little bit differently, hopefully, but I did it last night after a couple of glasses of wine, so you know. So as a bit of a background, I can see right now I made a mistake. It's April 2011. The Washington Office of the Forest Service research program said we want to invest in social vulnerability and adaptive capacity research. They didn't invest a lot, mind you, but they kind of got some of us at different stations together to begin to talk about what we are doing and what we could be doing. So in one sense, then there's kind of a national scope to this, and then I'm going to talk about my cases. The focus of the research initiative, as far as the stations were concerned, was to develop some frameworks to identify populations most vulnerable to climate change impacts. And populations, it could both mean communities, like communities of place, but also different social strata and social groups and so forth. Assess social vulnerability indices that might be applied at multiple scales, and then examine resources and tools and these kinds of things. So it's a pretty broad agenda, and it was only a paragraph, so we took license a little bit with what we wanted to do. One of the first things that we did was we organized a workshop in Missoula, Montana in November of 2011. We started with a literature review, which we're going to have a publication ready to go.
In Laurie's hands, I gave it to her 2 months ago.
Okay, so, but she's been busy writing some research proposal over the last year, so that kind of maybe got a little bit away. But we identified 3 tasks going forward: advance the state of knowledge, improve assessment protocols and so forth, bring community perspectives into the research, integrate social and ecological perspectives. We're interested in science application, and particularly the Forest Service has this thing called a scorecard that they're supposed to do vulnerability assessments on. So to what extent can we inform that process? And then, do research, which is what we're doing in my case, and then obviously some component of outreach and so forth. Now, interestingly, Shannon went through a whole bunch of stuff, and I think we in our literature review, we're covering much of the same ground. Because we wanted to say, well, what is vulnerability and social vulnerability in particular? And so we, came up with this matrix of looking at some different ways in which we can think about vulnerability. So this is sort of, again, the national perspective. We talked a lot about the difference between outcome-oriented vulnerability and contextual vulnerability. You saw this figure a few minutes ago. And at least for our project, what I'm working on in this region, we're focusing more on this idea of contextual vulnerability. But there are other people doing these other kinds of vulnerability analyses in other parts of the country. We identified a range of research methodologies and compared and contrasted how they might be applied. It's very similar to the figure, Shannon, that you put up right after this last one, but just organized a little bit differently. So again, we're starting with, what are the big questions, and then how do we frame these ideas, and then how do we apply them? This is the slide I presented day before yesterday that basically said, we went through the hazards literature, some of the political ecology literature, some of the climate change literature to say, well, what are the lessons we can learn conceptually from those literatures in terms of approaching social vulnerability? And then for my part, I organized the stuff that I wanted to do around kind of a comparative case study approach where we're using this iterative scenario building process. And we basically, the two cases that we're developing right now are Big Hole Valley in Montana and Grand County, Colorado. And Karina's she has a house up in Grand County right now, and she's doing interviews, like yesterday, for example, on this project. And we have a couple of other bits going in some other parts of the country, and even trying to work with some Norwegian colleagues, and maybe even some there may yet be some others in the North Central region. So just trying to be brief here on the scenario building idea. Basically taking this contextual approach to vulnerability. What we do is we get various climate scientists and ecological modelers together to develop verbal scenarios that describe changes in the landscape in these case study sites. They're roughly 400 words each. They're written in language that farmers and ranchers and tourism operators and so forth can absorb. And they try to look at about 20 years forward. And we've started by doing interviews with sort of the primary, if you will, stakeholders, just like individual ranchers, for example. This is a little bit more on how all those things were integrated with this slide. For example, big hole scenarios, we actually gave them names. Some like it hot, the seasons they are changing, feast or famine. We have the same labels for these things, a little bit different in the details of what's in the scenario. And basically, so the idea here is, I'm not sure where my slides are on some of these, but so we interview, for example, ranchers, small business owners, fishing and hunting outfitters. This is in the case of the Big Hole. So at the initial stage, we take these initial scenarios. We discuss those scenarios and get responses from these people on a one-on-one interview basis, so they can really share what they think they would do and what they think maybe their fellow ranchers might do or so forth from their own perceptions without any sort of bias from how the group might think. We take those scenarios, we revise those in concert with the same people that helped write the initial scenarios. So we're going back to the ecological side and getting their take on what these strategies are that the various people we've interviewed saw. And then we take those revised scenarios, and then we go more at a focus group level where we bring ranchers, for example, together in one room and discuss what these adaptations might be. At that level, we repeat that process where we revise yet those scenarios and then develop more of a workshop style thing where we've got multiple stakeholders from different sectors together to begin to discuss what those scenarios might be as they look across sectors. I think I basically just said that. And it looks something like this. If you really want to see this. Okay. Why am I going the wrong direction? There we go. So just real quick, for example, some of the things that you were just talking about, Cody, in terms of drought and ranchers was a real prominent feature of our big hole scenario, where, for example, under scenario 1, a junior ranch, the water rights have been that have, the people that hold the junior water rights were the most vulnerable as perceived by the ranchers. And they discussed some other things about how they might adapt. Under scenario 2, where there was a lot of, the moisture shifted to the winter, and you had prolonged summer droughts, then there was more of an emphasis on water storage, for example, to adapt to that. And under scenario 3, it was sort of like throw up your hands. This is a high variability scenario, because we can't plan for so much variability. Basically what we got out of that. And we're just, I mean, this stuff was done just last fall. Marina could maybe explain better than I what, you know, she's just doing the interviews now, and so we're just beginning to see how well does this process work in yet a different setting, a very different kind of place in this case, and it's seeing much more of a high amenity. We're all familiar with Grand County, Winter Park, basically, Granby, and west side of Rocky Mountain National Park. So among the things, one of the key things that we noticed there, which I guess is really getting to some of these, maybe just go through the left pros and then cons. So one is the multiple scenarios with lots of emphasis on uncertainty, and really works with the idea of, well, we're skeptical about climate change as, you know, as our sort of ideological position, but when we see them as, you know, embracing the uncertainty and then asking what can, you know, what are the adaptations, they're a little bit more comfortable with that kind of thinking. Obviously, it works well with these ideas of, you know, working a great deal under conditions of uncertainty, as does a lot of scenario-based planning. Hopefully captures the tension between the different groups and the different adaptation paths. And a bit like you were talking about, you know, you can look at past vulnerabilities, but you also need to be thinking about future vulnerabilities. So it really gets them looking forward in this context. Some of the challenges, impacts to human communities were considered quite bleak in these situations. In both cases, the year-to-year variability, scenario 3, was especially difficult to adapt to. And I think where we're going next is, okay, well, how do we move this? Because this is just a research project, you know, where we kind of come in and say, okay, we're going to do this, we're going to see how these scenarios work, how people can handle this kind of thinking. The question is, can we integrate this into actual decision-making processes or deal with specific issues? And that's where some of the things we want to go next. And how am I doing? I got 2 minutes left. Okay. So that's
good job.
All right. I know you're wanting a break.
Yeah, let's go ahead and take the break. We're not too far behind schedule, but if we could maybe just try and be back in here by 10:30, so Lisa can start getting set up. Yeah. So does everybody know where it is? It's over in the Science Center conference room, which is right down the hall. Follow the crowd.
I have a question for you. Have you guys, I mean, it sounds like you guys are going through a visioning, have you planned some of your questions on particulars? Well, you know, given these scenarios, looking at these impacts.
It's not really vulnerability, it's really interconnection. Survey. And did you get it? Yeah, we got like survey or things like that, you know, and you sticky, like when you ask so
unless we actually do what we hire, values, and actually
well, we have some, you know, one that gave us a hard time, wondering what our survey was all about and kind of skeptical. But we still got quite a few responses, ironed out that problem with them. It was, but yeah, we got a lot of good responses. It's probably biased towards people who are really, you know, believe in climate change, you know,
I feel like,
yeah, maybe we got some on the other side.
Well, there's a lot of things.
So I think we can have a snapshot of those at least engaged in the ground.
Are out there that where they are.
It's interesting to have you ask the visual question.
Right, well, my whole work is about connecting, what do people need? Yeah, I got a little, I need to walk around, with you.
Art, I think Jen would probably prefer we kept it out.
If there were 10 more people in the room,
Yeah.
you can go by there.
That's tough to do.
Where the ranchers we know exactly what's this.
But it's interesting, when you talk to the land managers, what would you, we've got the housing,
In the morning, I kind of talk about, like, reflect on the presentations and then getting into
direct share goals, and so everything has been tweaked out from that. So I think we're going to have different scenarios of different development trajectories.
but then that we, in the afternoon,
Any increase in development, one of that time stationary, and then the other one down, and that pairs a couple different scenarios, and then
maybe, it's kind of natural
and development, and find an actual part of overlay process now.
But this is sort of big ranching.
Apparently
framework and kind of how do we go about this and how do we participate in the ranching.
and we are like, we focus on how we go about planning, we already have the ranching
Part and have one.
and the landscape, is already a very complex landscape.
Thing where, something like that.
So there's a couple of private landowners, forestry, one of the ranches, quite interestingly, from the very first family having a ranch operation, they had an off-farm income, related to tourism. But I mean, not just contemporary, but it's going way back. So I think for a long time, it's been a very difficult county to make a living in, and the winters have been so harsh that, apparently it was quite common for the ranching community to go and work before it became a core ski resort, and it was still, so it's an interesting, I mean, there's a lot of trails there now, it's a really interesting case study of the kind of
Yeah, I was thinking that too. We've got,
in the water space.
we'll probably end up, let's say we have like one.
So will it, after the focus group, there's a community coming out of the market, I know I can, and I'll, and a meeting, I will let you know when the focus groups are.
I mean, this is kind of
When Shannon was talking about the down stuff, and then Corey now, each one, case study. comparison and look across the world, I think they're very, between the older views and how to deal with the divided policies. One of the other interesting things and I've got to go back and look at what is still a bit of it, but I get a sense that there's a little bit of the don't tell me about this but finding it how they want to be whereas the people who are really
have you
really concerned about climate change
well yeah we work at the
how would you respond to this? And it's like we need the government to educate people more about blah blah blah. And a lot of it's on they're not willing adaptation as a this is the future that you're going to get. How are you going to deal with it?
It's interesting. Values and perception. Almost like Anthony Yale said.
Yeah.
No, it sounds fascinating.
Well, yeah, no, we'd be more than happy to. I mean, it's one of my frustrations with the project because it's not connected into anything at the moment is. So it's not connected into anything. I'm not just working in space.
There are two particular sort of models that we use, and also getting in front of them that might be one is to go for the big science money and then try to carve out station and average, and the other is to go for things that are explicitly applied average demonstration projects and use them as an opportunity for research. And then what we found with those is that it was just
Are you still leaving halfway through the day?
I am.
Well, yeah, I mean, if you have anything you can send me, and then maybe we could do like a webinar for you to present some of that stuff. Would that be of interest to you, like to our working group? That would be, I think, a good way.
I mean, I tend to work at very much. You have three high-level people here, mostly, as you say, researchers, and I tend to work very much with the local level agency people, sometimes state level. And but Mongolia is such a small country that you kind of work with everyone all the time. Again, my focus is very mostly herders, development organizations.
We didn't have a lot of research stations, so that you had worked. There are certain racers there that they had worked with literally for 3
Oh shoot, I'm sorry, I must have paused the show off right now.
People get that.
I'm pause the recording while we have the
ranchers, and we did all of our own projects.
Put it all later.
Hi Bob, I'm Maria from Adaptation. It's nice to meet you.
I'll probably forget to turn it back on.
What struck me with the last tribal stuff down at the Adaptation Forum was talking that came out of actually the ecology, indigenous ecologies. Same way you talk about indigenous people in the world. Across whether you're managers, scientists, researchers, different things. Don't expect that. And it's easier to see the difference to talk about in terms of culture and pride. We all speak the same language. We don't.
That's actually what a lot of our work is. Mostly local knowledge exchanges, whether it's medicinal science, and also treating kind of scientific knowledge, professional knowledge. So we document all those knowledge, and then we create very the integration. It can't work.
Right, but it works only if you're all conscious that these are different knowledges. My sociology professor defines sociology as meaningful elaboration of the object. But it's your object, not somebody else's.
if I, in the past, worked a lot with kids, now I don't work so much with
Well, we've been in touch with some folks from Australia, and through the ITCC, UN University. Really good. We finally, it was almost a sigh of relief at the National Adaptation Summit. Finally, the science stuff. It's good. We can turn to the real stuff. We have the information. Now what do we do about it? Kind of thing. Around the world are now being called about it. We're SOL. What do we do? This is science. Is that right? Now, how do we know?
And like Dennis said,
You guys to get here. I've been telling you all along. But now you can see yourself. Welcome.
Yeah, I mean, people are, fully, I mean, I'm experiencing this and have been experiencing it, and I'm very aware.
Without all of the assumptions science requires, our modeling is wrong in that it's too late. Our modeling is on late. Stuff is happening now already that we're still predicting. Yes.
All right. We'll get people to help with it. And plus we're recording it too, so you guys remind me to turn pause the recording or turn it off at lunch. I mentioned it for this and I look at it feeling.
All right, let's. So where's our speakers? Where's Lisa and?
Go herd them, Dennis. Go get them.
They were all here. Okay, I'll go.
You're the herder.
Ready, lady? I'm ready. You're up and running. Start talking really loud. Oh, I guess
Yeah, Dennis.
She'll give you a 5. A 5 and either a 2 or a 1.
All right, let's get started, you guys.
There's not that many left, so let's get started.
Yeah, let's get started. All right. I'll get started here. So again, I'm Lisa Dilling from University of Colorado Boulder, and my charge is to talk about a specific project, but also I've done a little bit of the overview of the projects that I'm involved in. The overarching motivation for my research is really geared towards improving societal outcomes with respect to climate-related risk. I'm just going to blow through this, but if you have questions on any of these projects, these are the things I've been working on, and we can connect in various ways. So one research area I work on is how can information be more usable in decision-making. This really looks at the interface between the production of scientific information and the use of that information in society. It's really at that gap between, if you remember Shannon's picture, and the idea of like, well, we get to a certain point and then there's like not implementation. It's really the connection between decision-makers and the production of science, and I have some different projects in that area about later. The others are, the second area is how do decision processes incorporate climate-related risk and opportunity. I've done some work both on carbon management and on adaptation in different contexts in public lands, in municipalities, and in the urban water sector. The third area that relates to this overarching question is what kinds of factors shape adaptive capacity of organizations. And I've looked at water governance at the state level, public lands management and adaptation, and then I have a project that both Travis in this room and Andrea in this room are also involved in, looking at how urban water systems respond to drought and how that positions them for climate change or for other kinds of changes. For today, I'm going to focus in on the public lands work I've done. That's what Shannon really asked me to focus on, so happy to talk about other stuff that's great too. Real briefly, well, I guess the font got weird. In case you're not familiar at all with it, I'm a member of the Western Water Assessment. Chris Neighbor in the back is the director of it, and Bill and Andrea and others of us here are involved in that project.
Really quickly, its mission is to identify and characterize regional vulnerabilities to climate variability and change, and to develop the information, products, and processes that assist decision makers throughout the West, Intermountain West, I should say. And it's really been focused around water and its various manifestations in the landscape. We've had projects, we've been going since 1999 or so. This is our regional area, Colorado, Utah, and Wyoming, so it kind of overlaps with the Climate Science Center here on the Central State side. Some of our projects, I'm not going to talk about all these at all, but we have worked on snow melt and hydrology, climate modeling, work on the bark beetles and the impact of the bark beetles on hydrology, work on how the deposition of dust on snow affects the hydrologic cycle, which has been pretty strong interest to our stakeholders. We've had work looking at the flow forecast from the Colorado Basin River Forecast Centers, work on tribal climate preparedness. I've been doing some work on adaptation in cities. Bill Travis has been involved with ranchers, working with ranchers and farmers and drought preparedness there. We have a project with Betsy, Bill has a project with Betsy Neely and the Nature Conservancy. So we've got work going on in lots of different areas that I'm happy to talk about in the break for others of us. For now, though, I'm going to move on to some of the data that we produced through a project led by my student, Kelly Archie. Actually, she's not my student anymore. She just graduated and now newly minted PhD, and she really led this work. And this is a survey that we did that came out of some work we'd done on a qualitative basis of interviewing public lands managers around Colorado that I had done, where we found out there was a big disconnect. There's a federal, a very strong, a mandate to do adaptation in federal lands agencies. But when I started interviewing people on the ground, there wasn't a lot of knowledge or sort of how do we actually do that? How do we incorporate climate change into decision making on the ground in agencies? So I had some qualitative work on that, but we decided to look more broadly with a quantitative survey on how widespread was this planning for adaptation, implementation of adaptation across federal land agencies here. So that's that first question. What kinds of challenges do Western public lands managers currently face regarding climate change adaptation? What tools or resources do they currently use to get information about climate change? Where do they get that information from? And does the demand for information vary among agencies? Different agencies kind of need different types of information. Our study region, again, is based on our Western Water region, the region of Utah, Colorado, and Wyoming. In this room, I probably don't need to say this given how the composition of the audience here, but just to remind us that in some of these states, the public land area can be quite high percentage of the total land area. In Utah, it's 70% of the land area is actually in federal management. Colorado is 30%, Wyoming about 30%. So this is not a trivial amount of land area that's being managed by the federal government and where adaptation is in question. So our method was to do a large online survey. It was in 2011, so things are moving fast in this area, so just bear that in mind with our data and our results. It might be different if you did this survey today. We surveyed 4 agencies, BLM, National Park Service, U.S. Forest Service, and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in these 3 states. And Kelly went through and really found contacts for all of these agencies of people on the ground in each office within these agencies and focused on the decision-making side of it for those who were supporting decision-making directly. So people that were in the line office actually doing permitting decisions, doing EIS, EA kind of work, or people that were specialists that were providing data for those kinds of analyses. We sent the survey to 3,100 people in total, got about 676 responses, which is decent for an online survey. This is sort of what the demographics look like of our responses. And we did hit sort of our target audience, and that's about more than 60% had spent half their time or more dealing with land management issues. Our audience was a little bit more skewed, I would say, than the general population in the United States, in that 73% said climate change is real, happening now, and felt that they were moderately informed about climate change. 85% said that. So if you looked at a survey nationally, that would not be quite that high of a percentage. So first we got a little bit of context on our population, just to see what they saw as their top 5 management challenges. Funding, of course, always comes up. Species and habitat management, stakeholder conflict, personnel constraints, and conflicting mandates. As you can imagine, for multiple use agencies, that's going to be something that comes out strongly. Across the agencies, and these were very much said over and over again as severe challenges: species and habitat management and lack of funding. So just given, I think this is great that this meeting here is focusing on the social ecological connection, because this issue, it really comes up as a strong issue across the agency. So, who's doing planning so far? Not who's doing it, but is it happening so far? We asked this question. This is about planning. So, is the plan currently being developed? That's about a quarter of the population surveyed. Yes, the plan is being carried out, only a very small amount, about 5% actually being carried out. Don't know is about 23%, and I'm sorry, this is hard to read in this color, isn't it? I have it in color on my other slides. It's like hard to read in black and white. But basically, the no was the larger. And I should say this whole paper is published. I can give you the link to the copy of it. It's open access. All right. So just how does this break down across the agencies? Again, these colors look a little weird, but here's Fish and Wildlife, National Park Service, U.S. Forest Service, and BLM. So yes, the plan is currently being developed, sort of evenly spread. Plan is being carried out. Tends to be higher in the Forest Service and Fish and Wildlife Service. No, BLM was the agency that had was a little bit farther behind, if you want to characterize it that way, but did not have as much of work going on yet in terms of carrying out the plan, and then they had some that were going out.
So really, it's Forest Service and Parks that are the
Well, actually, I should say these are by numbers of responses, not percentages, so it's hard to say that exactly. Basically, the Fish and Wildlife Service is actually the most, let's say, far ahead, because we hypothesize because they have a very focused mission. It has to do with endangered species. So for them, they have to basically be incorporating climate change to characterize endangered species for when they're taking actions on them. But that was the only significant correlation. We looked at all sorts of different things about beliefs of the person that we were surveying, or types of education, all these different things. The only significant correlation with climate status was the agency you were in. So that was pretty interesting, sort of why that is, I don't know, but we can guess. I'll just give you a couple. How am I doing on time? Yeah, sure. Okay. I'll just give a smattering of data. Again, you can look at the paper and read everything in detail if you're interested. But this question we asked, what are the most important factors preventing you from planning for adaptation to climate change? This is the planning piece only. And then going through top 3 choices. You can see information really pops out here. Like the top response was lack of information at relevant scales, but budget constraints was just almost as big. So like budget constraints always is going to trump a lot of things. Uncertainty comes up as quite a high thing. Lack of agency direction. Now this was a couple years ago, 2011. Maybe those directions are a little bit clearer now, but we heard a lot of times that there was this general incorporate climate change into your decision making. And then the person on the ground making these decisions on a day-to-day basis is like, I don't know what that means for me and for my job. So that was sort of a little bit of that coming out, I think. And then some of these other things, stakeholder conflict was not nearly as important. Okay, this is probably too much to go through, but you can look at interesting differences across the agencies, because that was a significant thing. We asked about the usefulness of different types of information. Lots of useful information, in terms of people saying very useful often for information on how to assess the vulnerability of specific, I believe that's the species, as we look after the dots. Historic climate data, weather, seasonal climate forecast, long-term climate projections, a little bit less useful climate projections. So the idea being that we think we kind of gear on predictions a lot, thinking about we need to have these predictions of the climate and downscale them and so on, but there's a lot of other types of information that's actually even maybe more useful. So just a message to think about that there's a broad range of information then finally, the issue of implementation, crossing that little gap, planning. We all get really far along to planning, but then actually implementing action seems to be this hurdle. So what are the hurdles to implementation of adaptation? This is different. It's a little bit interesting in that way. Budget, of course, comes out, but always has come up. You can't say that's a truism, but the lack of perceived importance to the public. A lot of decision makers in public land management are really responsive to their public and to the, to the input on the processes as they go through NEPA and so on. And I think there's sort of a chicken and egg thing of like, well, our publics are not necessarily calling for us to pay attention to this, so we don't know how important it is, but we think it's important, but waiting for that signal. But here again, second question that popped out, lack of public awareness or demand for that. Social acceptability of strategies, staff resources. I mean, these things are all came up in some degree, but some of them rank a little bit higher than others. Okay, well, I've got some time. So anyway, basically, I would sort of rephrase this first bullet a little bit. There is planning going on. You can't say there's no planning. There's planning going on for sure, but actually going over to the implementation side of it, actually taking action on adapting to climate change, there's a lot less of that. Lack of information does seem to be a barrier, but there's a lot of other barriers out there as well, including just funding, having the staff time. I mean, this, we all know the budget environment and the staff environment we're living in right now. The scale of useful information is important. We know this too. You can't give a giant gridded model and expect it to be useful necessarily at people's scale. But this is variation. There's variation across agencies, really knowing the context of the agency that you're looking at and what kinds of things are supposed to support. This issue about the public and how much the public is demanding us to consider climate change, or this issue of do we need to kind of reach out to the public, educate the public. This is an open question, but it's seen in people's minds anyway, as people who surveyed it, as a barrier to moving forward. Are we going to stick our necks out and move forward and do some plans on climate change, and then the publics are going to sort of, be mad at or get on our case. So, and then this final question about the significance of the differences in planning speed and moving forward across the agencies is that we don't have explanation for that. We don't know exactly why that is. But we threw out a couple of maybe hypotheses of why that might be. But this is something kind of interesting as well. So I think that's my last. Yeah, that's my last slide. So there you go. And I'm happy to take questions later on. Is that right? Yeah.
Yeah, I have a hypothesis that there's a big disconnect between what managers think the public believes or supports and what the public actually really thinks.
Right. Yeah, that's just what they said they thought.
And I think that's a big research question and potentially a possible fodder for us to look at. All right, Dengong, you are last but not least. I see you have 29 slides.
Oh.
You had talked about 29 slides. I'm like, 15 minutes, so.
Thank you, Sharon.
Yeah, thank you.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Shen Tan from the Community Regional Planning Program at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. I appreciate Dennis and Shannon to encourage me to be here. I think I'll give a talk about how the planners respond to climate change. I'll probably to try to answer the questions, the homework Shannon assigned to me. What's the initial question? What's the scope? What's the method? What's the policy implementation? So I try to dig in the research I conducted recently in the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, try to address Shannon's question in here. So I probably today I will address three types of the projects I'm working on. First is the climate impact for the fire wetlands in the Nebraska. Basically, the federal agency want to understand where they should invest the money to implement the project in the fire wetlands. Second is how the state and local planners respond to climate change and upstream events. Third is one of my recent interests in how the citizens should be engaged in part of the climate change assessment as well as adaptation process by use of volunteering geographical information. So the first one is basically guys ask me, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service people ask me, where's a good place to install the pipeline station for the wetlands? And how can we prioritize the investments in the future? So the work project scope is in the River Basin, which covers 21 counties in the Nebraska, and also the method is basically use more geospatial modeling and some index method to do that. So there are over 11,000 wetlands in that area. The federal and state guys are really struggling with which one we should do the investment. And because this area is very unique and there is 12 million birds every year, so it's become very important economically and ecologically in the area. And however, they are very vulnerable from the climate change. They are really interesting. The county project or program will be affected by the future climate changes. Whether, like for example, whether they need inputs, some like temperature spacing in some wetlands areas, they're not that sure. And also how can we prioritize the conservation programs under the climate change scenarios? There's so many of the wetlands in that area. So we do introduce some new technology, but I don't think this group are interested in that. But we use a LiDAR technology, which is a high resolution basic remote sensing technology, and try to identify whether the federal national wetland inventory map as well as the soil database map, they clean out the wetland are accurate or not. Actually, we found they are changing. And also, we'll do some modeling. That's not the scope of this group interesting as well. But we do some modeling to help us understand the multi-criteria restorable wetland index. And we have model meetings with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service as well as the state agency to understand how can we fertilize that. We consider vegetation, soil, and the potential water releasing, some hydrological depression status, as well as the habitat conditions to try to fertilize the index. Eventually, we suggest only 1.6 of them, if they have money, they can extend to some others, like 7.7% of the medium-high restorable potential. If they have more money, they can move up. But if the money is big enough, they can move to that low possibility size that could be successful or restorable. So which is consistent with the annual habitat survey. The annual habitat survey only suggests 2.9 of them that are functional in wetland in inundation during the migratory bird season. So I think we make the scientific link for the federal, state, and local agency to help them to understand that how can we use the less money to make the maximal benefits from the investments in the future, and also try to help them to understand the program to be successful with the full hydrological restoration rather than just focus with the site level, and to understand the restoration at the watershed level. So that's the first project. So I think it's a little bit more with the physical science portion, but we do have the index system to do that. The second project, I think that's mainly the social policy project as a planner in training, and how the local land use planners or the municipal planners as well as the state level planners should respond to the climate change and extreme events. I think Lisa would like to talk with something that most of the research has been done by myself, having contact at the national level. And the method, basically we use a content analysis and a plan evaluation article to evaluate that. So that's one of the maps. I geocode all of the local actions dealing with the climate change related issues, whether they already adopted any local climate action plans or joined the climate protection campaign, or they may only sign up the climate protection agreement, try to understand the issues at the national level. And the funniest is that since I only have 7 5 minutes left. So the quick finding is currently the local decision makers or the planners have a high level of awareness of the climate change. They also have some analysis dealing with the climate change related issue like vulnerability and risk assessment, as well as the greenhouse gas emission inventory analysis. But they do take some actions, but most of the action focuses on the built environment, like energy, emission reduction, transportation with the buildings. That's one of the purposes that, because the funding has come from the EPA after them doing the climate action plans. The EPA only care that the greenhouse gas emissions. So the current plans are focused on with the greenhouse gas emission itself rather than adaptation. And they not really care with the natural environment, like ecosystem, agriculture, rural lands, or the public lands. That's out of the scope. So we also recently do some work with all the 100 top fastest growing counties in the United States respond to some extreme events like drought. So I don't have time to talk with the result. That's basically overall they are not that good prepared for the future droughts and the water shortages. And the maximum score should be 50, but none under the 40 and 50 categories. So they have some actions dealing with to address the future droughts, but not really with the full capacity. We also do a little bit work with the National Drought Mitigation Center, Mark Sovenda, with to give an overview with the state drought planning for the extreme events issue. So we found that they're doing something well with the hazard analysis and vulnerability analysis, but the risk management scope technically it should be like a 1 to 10 scope, but they are basically less than half. So the overall the capacity still have a big room to be improved. I think the coach already addressed that. Most of the plans are more crisis response rather than the risk management approaches to adjust the future. So that's basically I would say for the local and state drought planning. Currently, they have limited awareness and preparedness for the water shortage and the drought. Fail to integrate the drought mitigation adaptation strategies into the long-range development plans, like a local comprehensive land use plans. Also, Shiana mentioned about some very important documents, like for National Park Service conservation, resources conservation plan, or some other types of plans. I think that's probably under my scope to do the further research in the future. And most of the plans at this moment, they are just with the emergency response rather than more with the risk management to try to think of the issue ahead to be more towards more adaptation, involvement, implementation issues that we are fully discussing today. So I only have the last one, only need 2 minutes, save 3 minutes with Dennis and for discussion. So the last project, I think the EPA found me to look about how can we promote the citizen engagement, actually not fully for climate change. They are interested in the green infrastructure issues by use the voluntary geographical information. The research of the study area is in Nebraska. Actually, I extend to the national level. So the method that we use that similar like a Google Earth, but we use a more advanced ideas by using the mobile devices to promote this idea. So we develop a number of the geospatially enabled mobile applications try to help the federal agency to understand how many green infrastructures we have. So because like how many rain barrels, how many rain gardens we have, of course the federal can send the people job around to take all our picture, to geocode everything, but it's almost impossible. So we are trying to help them to use more grassroots approach, let the citizens have the ability to use their cell phone to report to the federal. So basically it's under the big picture of the planning in geospatially mobile enabled or GPS enabled society, because that's a kind of new chain in currently. This is another one, made by the Rhode Island University, University of Rhode Island, whatever. So they use a web-based mapping to try to capture all of the low-impact development projects at the national level. So we try to use the mobile devices that the cities have the direct power, as well as the stakeholders directly report to the national system. So we are going to develop more advanced reporting and monitoring system for them. So basically, the policy implementation is a voluntary geographical information empowered by the GPS-enabled electronic mobile devices, and also plus with the social media, social network that deal with a big data system that give us a tremendous power to report, to monitor the climate change vulnerability and adaptation in the future. All of this are still challenge. How can we link the science, technology, and the cities' interest? And we're struggling with that. So dealing with the group conclusion in here, the last minutes in here. So I think the potential collaboration with you guys here is, I think it's probably is good to build up a baseline tracking evaluation database, try to evaluate existing government plans or documents in this North Central area to try to understand what's the baseline today and what's the future 10 years later, and let them trackable, comparable documentable for the future efforts for climate change. I think that's probably valuable for everyone. Secondly, I think it might be a good idea to build up a crowdsource climate change adaptation or assessment atlas to allow the stakeholders and the citizens use mobile devices or platform to participate in the atlas for the citizen reporting for the vulnerability and adaptation implementation practices. So, perfect time. Many thanks. Good time.
Whose sound is that? Is that on your phone, Dennis?
I think it's my computer. I don't even know. I've never heard it do that before.
So maybe it's just a coincidence that came right at the end there?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
I have nothing to do with that.
Really. All right, thank you guys. So now we have about an hour for discussion, which I think is good. And we want to accomplish a couple of things. And Judy and Nina are going to help me facilitate this session and write things on the board. One, we want to use about maybe half that time, more or less, to sort of reflect on everything that was presented this morning. And then,
would you rather use that or the sheet?
For now, I think we'll just use the board. And then move into kind of, identifying sort of a shared goals and milestones and measures for success for this effort. And then keeping in mind that we have the afternoon after lunch to basically start to get into sort of identifying, in general, the sort of research agenda. So identifying research projects, gaps, needs on the one hand, and then also sort of the process moving forward. And we talked about a couple different ways to organize the afternoon, so maybe be thinking about this, because we have some ideas for it, but we want this to sort of be a collective decision on what you guys think will be the most effective way to sort of utilize our time here together in the best possible way. And so we talked about, do we stay as a group? Because we're kind of on that cusp. We're relatively small, but working groups, breakouts are usually most effective at about sort of 7 to 10 people, more or less. So we could break out into a couple of breakout groups, keeping in mind that then that takes more time to sort of report back and assess what we all talked about and blah, blah, blah. So think about, ideas for how you think we can best do that based on activities you've been involved in the past, based on what we talk about now this morning. We talked about a couple different ways to organize it. again, it could be in these sort of, the research, the kind of intellectual sort of angle, and then the process angle is sort of two kind of natural bins that people could be working on. And then we kind of tossed around some other ideas about, organizing around problems or topics, organizing geographically, but I think probably because we're so small, it's better to somewhat stay cohesive in what we're talking about. So anyway, just to plant that seed that we're looking for your feedback as we're talking through the morning and the afternoon. So I think first I want to open it up to you guys to ask questions, reflect on what you saw this morning. I think, the reason for having these presentations is to sort of be having this ongoing dialogue and sort of getting to know each other. We can't really be a network or community of practice unless we really know what each other's doing. So, Dan.
One reflection, I was thinking a little bit about this earlier when you had question 4 up there, was the role of local knowledge. We did talk a little bit about, from the knowledge producers to the knowledge users, and one of the ways I think about these problems is how do you capitalize on the knowledge that locals have, whether those are citizens, which the citizen science thing made me think of as well, or managers or indigenous communities and things like that. So some kind of, maybe it's a bin topic or something like that, but it's kind of the idea of moving knowledge, moving both from the bottom up, if you will, and from the top down. And how do you both capture all that kind of knowledge, and how do you organize the processes, that associated with using that stuff. And I also just mentioned that I thought the bit about citizen science was really interesting, and people began to explore how to use blog posts and other sorts, not just the GPS devices, but people's social networking and other kinds of things, which is a kind of form of local knowledge, I guess, in a way.
Yeah, that's a great point, and I'm glad you said that, because that's really important to the research that I do, and I have been campaigning when it's appropriate to, these projects that we're developing, these proposals, to actually be trying to integrate managers' observations and knowledge of their system into whatever we're doing, because I do think that two-way knowledge is really, really important. The citizen science thing too, and that reminded me, I wanted to mention, we as the North Central Climate Science Center are more or less a formal partner of the National Climate Assessment, and kind of a hub for what they're calling the sustained assessment. And gosh, I sure wish we had this workshop before we wrote the Great Plains Technical Report, because we were really looking, there's so much great stuff going on. I think a lot of that's because it's just now evolving. You weren't doing the stuff you were doing yet. I don't think you guys were doing the stuff you were doing. You might have been doing some of it, but we didn't know you. But I'm glad we know you now. We used a lot of Cody's work in the Great Plains region. So this is basically all of our region except Colorado, although we formally in the NCA, but we included Colorado as well. We used Cody's work. But anyway, I'm just planting that seed because, one, the NCA Net has a citizen science activity as part of it that we might think about as a mechanism if that helps us in our effort. And two, I'm one of my in the back of my mind goals for what we're doing here is to be informing the next national climate assessment, and how do we best set ourselves up for the region to really get this kind of research in there, because the fact of the matter was, when we were doing the Great Plains Technical Assessment, we had a really hard time finding stuff in the literature for the social ecological vulnerability and adaptation framing. So to kind of plant that seed. Wow.
Comment I made during the break, Shannon, but I want to make it to the group. If you think of it in terms of knowledges, yes, which is something that's come out of the indigenous knowledge, traditional knowledge conversations tribes have been having, indigenous peoples have been having, of realizing there's many bodies of knowledges around, and when we use it as a singular, we make a false assumption that we all share it. And we don't. And this is the same thing that holds for researchers and managers. We don't. And we've got to find ways to carefully understand that and to bridge those gaps and integrate them where possible.
Yeah, I kind of like the frame of non-traditional observation systems. So just because you are thinking about, I mean, I love that app and just being able to, you know, I think about the Phenology Network. I love the idea of being able to take my phone out and take a photograph of this is what's going on. But then also flipping that on its head and being able to use that from a research perspective. And then, you know, oral histories, et cetera. I think that is just in this budget environment, especially, you just don't have the observation system.
Anything you can put on your phone is just really good.
I would call that non-conventional versus traditional.
There you go.
Because
yeah.
there's a lot of traditions that aren't part of the convention.
Better, yes. There
Good
we go.
point, Bob. Maria.
Well, this was very interesting for me, and I've been trying to think how I could contribute or be useful to the efforts. Both of the vulnerability and adaptation, the conversation work I do is international rather than domestic, and also what I do domestic rate is on adaptive management. They're not specifically related to climate, but so two things I thought. One is that the work we've done in Mongolia, we have done some vulnerability assessments that incorporate a lot of different social methodologies, and those might be useful. Both there's a very long form, and then there's a much more concise and published form that people will find no change, and then there's sort of the through the herder's eye participatory form of those. So I don't know if that'd be useful as a model for something that
yeah, I was saying, we talked about this at the break, and I was saying it might be a really good webinar we could have to share those lessons learned, and then you were talking about how you have lessons learned working with federal managers in the region, not necessarily specifically on climate.
Yeah, so then the other pieces, and both in Mongolia and here, are modus operandi generally, whether the project is sort of big science funded MSF or whether it's more, a lot of my work is funded more to the extension outreach demonstration projects, and then the science builds off of that. Almost all the projects are some form of participatory. So even our great big, $1.5 million, 36-site project in Mongolia started with a collaborative effort where we had 20 herders together with scientists and development and industry people defining the research questions, actually creating the hypotheses involved in the study design, and then they continue to be involved in that process. It's kind of similar more with ranchers, federal, but it's literally at the grassroots of the range planting content on the ground in a very literal and building up from there. I don't know if that's the right scale for the kind of things you're thinking of, but it does, I mean, in our experience, the best way to get people to, understand and adopt, understand the science and then adopt the practices that are the implications of that science is to start at that level, and then they become invested and curious and want to learn more, and then become really a part of the process, that co-creation of the knowledge that becomes the consumers.
Yeah, I think, I'll get to it, but I think that, there's a theme here, which has to do with this, bottom-up, participatory, integrating local knowledge sort of approach. And I think a big question for us as a Climate Science Center is what's the best role that we can play to help support that kind of work? Because it takes a long time. It is very place-based. It's a very different approach than, the very top-down, data-driven approach. And so far, having been in this world as a researcher myself, it's, I go out and I find money where I can to do the work. And I think we all do that to a certain extent. And so therefore, it's very patchy. It's a lot of case study work, and I think we all as a community struggle with how do we scale this up in an efficient and effective way, but still honoring and acknowledging the difficulty and time it takes to actually do that type of work. So that's just kind of a big sort of general thing that I'm throwing out there, but all of this kind of lands in that camp.
One thought there is, that we need to go back to sort of institutional designs as well. But there's a lot of local knowledge that can be captured, or knowledges that can be captured and integrated. problem is what are the institutional mechanisms by which those get interjected into these processes. And so, I mean, my first thought was running to, is it the researcher's job to yard all this up, or is it that we need some institutions and communities of practice and networks and so forth that actually learn how to capture and utilize that knowledge and interject it into decision-making processes, because there'll never be enough researchers to do it for us, in a sense.
Right.
I mean, I that's part of what I do, so I can have some proposed answers to that and some different models that we looked at for doing it.
Do you want to talk about that now, or is that something?
Well, but I mean, if people want to hear that now, but I don't want to monopolize.
Could you put it like on the parking lot or something?
Yeah, actually, I have a question for you, Barry, that actually ties to what you were talking about. I mean, and it's kind of, Dennis and Jeff, perhaps you can answer this as well. Regional climate science center, so you want to affect decisions there, but what are the scales of high points? I'm hearing institutional scales, but then are they local, are they state? I'm hearing the individual actor. So what are you guys looking at the entire scale of decision making, to be from the individual rancher individual up to federal institute, or are you looking to just kind of define one or a couple of those groups?
I don't have an answer to that.
I just wonder if that's something to consider, because I'm hearing all the discussion going on, and in terms of bounding what you can practically do, I mean, there's sectoral, there's scalar, so that's kind of what my question was.
I think my vision, the thing that we're working towards, I think in my own little ways, one of my projects is sort of trying to build multi-scale learning networks that are very local, and then
Multi-scale, what was the third one?
Learning network.
Learning.
And so in the Mongolia thing, we actually started very large and then went back local, and we're going kind of back and forth. In the project that we have right now in Western Colorado, started with one watershed where we worked for quite a long time, and now we're scaling out to 6 or 7 different sites across Western Colorado and Wyoming, but with the idea that we had a kickoff meeting 2 weeks ago, that we start out by bringing people from all these sites together, so we're all on the same page, and then break them into, working groups where they define what they want to do for their sites. But what's built into kind of the design is that we'll come back at regular intervals and do that kind of cross-site learning, so that hopefully there'll be something that we learn at a broader scale, which in this case is important as part of what we do with the big stuff habitat.
Beth, I'd be curious to hear your response to Kristen's question, because I think she's right. It is a fundamentally important issue, and one thing that goes on in my head, so I want to give you the opportunity to give your perspective as our director, but a lot of times, obviously the federal agencies are our primary constituents, because we're supported by DOI, and we've got the LCCs that are our advisory committee, so that's kind of a no-brainer that at least at that scale we're working. But to me, it depends a lot on the agency that you're dealing with and the place that you're dealing with, because it depends on land tenure and how the resources are managed and what kind of institutional relationships are in that particular place and what those managers are dealing with. And the BLM is dealing with really different issues a lot of times than, say, Park Service. And so their needs are going to be different in a lot of cases. In some cases, they're similar where where their jurisdictions kind of overlap. But I just wanted to bring up this map, and it's not to show you anything you guys don't already know, but I think it is really interesting to think about the fact that, this is basically our region, and the brown areas are federal lands. So, I mean, this is our whole eastern portion of our region is not dominated by federal lands. And the pink are tribes, by the way, Bob. So,
Thanks for the distinction.
So anyways, I think this is a really interesting visual for the question that you're asking and how we as a region think about this, because it's no surprise that in our eastern part of the region, we're dealing with a lot more ranching communities, a lot less federal lands, a lot less federal land ownership, much more private ownership. And in the western portion of our basin, mainly the Intermountain portion, it's a lot of federal land. There's still ranching in there, and there's still, within basins, like my Yampa and shale desert and ranching, you know, so even within that, just that basin, you've got that kind of division. So, anyway, I just wanted to kind of set that context, because I think it's important to keep in mind, so I'm curious to hear your perspective on that.
I think you were right on with the Department of Interior Climate Science Center, so I think it's the federal land managers who are mainly directing as our constituents. I think it's at a scale less than national, so the National Forest Service plan may result on it, but that's not kind of our mandate. I think what we've done more, I'm trying to think of like a two-dimensional space of a temporal or a spatial scale versus explicit kind of scale, or, you know, kind of like vague or general research needs versus decisions that are going to be made. And I think we focused kind of on that domain, but maybe across the spatial scale in our solicitation. And what we're trying to do is, you know, is there a decision that's going to be made? So is the Bureau of Land Management going to move towards indicator speed for preservation? So that's kind of that's a pretty big scale, almost national. But if somebody's going to be making that decision in 2 or 3 years, and our climate science can help with it, then we see that as something we're trying to work with. So it was more, I think what we, for better or worse, gravitated towards is an explicit decision. And that goes to some of the things we've been talking about this morning, and I'll say comments. I think it's worth discussing that decision space or that decision room. I wonder if that tied into Lisa's survey that showed information, you know, is that kind of buried in that question of scale? That you know, you know, scale kind of is one way to frame it, but is kind of within that. You're not answering the question. It's going to help me make my decision. You know, this is great and informative, but I can do 3 things, and you're kind of telling me, you know, something that I don't have the trade space or I don't have the decision space to do. And I think that the useful to usable, I think, is getting at it. So I think a couple of threads, and Shannon had this slide about decision space. I think that seems to me, and so maybe this is a question, as a very tangible thing to hook into, is who's making a decision, and, you know, what is that decision? What are your options? And let's work the research towards that. So, you know, but in some ways I was wondering, is this like going to a doctor, and instead of him taking your temperature and figuring out what's wrong, his first question is, will you take pills or you do surgery? You know, let's figure out what's But, you know, maybe we're further along than that. We know we have a fever, we know something's wrong. Okay, so now are you willing to go in for surgery, or are you willing to be on medicine the rest of your life? You know, so maybe that analogy is okay, and it's legitimate to say, let's think about what the patient's willing to do, or, you know, what are they up against this weekend with this problem.
Can I say one tiny quick thing data-wise on just, and then another question that we asked that's really, I think, important for this issue of how we're talking with people in the end, or communicating with people, or getting our research out there, if it's meant to be informing a decision, is that there's a lot of different goals out there. I heard support the national assessment, which applies published research. Published research, it turns out, is not that accessed by people making decisions at in the federal lands. Even scientists, I mean, they do consult it, you know, but not nearly as often as things internally, for example, or colleagues even. So somehow thinking about, but yet you still need the peer review, the best available science, you know, to support a formal decision. So I think that's just another parking lot or something saying about there's multiple goals, and they're going to imply different types of products or different types of ways of operating to get the information.
I'm thinking along the same lines as Lisa. I written down what the goals are, and mentioned the national assessment, coming up with information for that. Are we putting together a vulnerability assessment framework or maybe procedure for federal land managers to use, or us to use?
Yeah.
Because we did all these planning guides quite a bit. So we pull out what the theory says, and we have to think, okay, if I'm a state drought planner, what's step 1?
Right.
What am I going to do?
That's actually that's a good question, and I'm glad you said that, because I meant to mention this earlier, which is a lot of the agencies already have their own vulnerability assessment guidance documents, for example, I was just at the Adaptation Forum yesterday. There was a session on the Fish and Wildlife Service Rapid Vulnerability Assessment Approach. No one was there because none of the Fish and Wildlife Service, there were literally three of us, me, Jason Bogle, and one other woman. And I don't even think he was supposed to have 3 sessions, but anyways, the point being is that I have already started collecting all these vulnerability assessment documents, and, you know, the Park Service has their whole climate change response framework and their scenario planning process and all of this. So, in answer to your question, I don't think that we're necessarily creating new frameworks or approaches. I think we need to figure out how to integrate with what they're already doing and figure out how we can support that. And I know, at least as far as the Fish and Wildlife Service, because I asked him, where are you with this? Have you actually implemented this anywhere? Do you have funding to continue this? And he said that they're not surprisingly stalled at the moment, but he's meeting, they've had like 2 case studies where they've gone through it and trained the managers and done the vulnerability assessments on these different refuge systems. But he was meeting with some higher ups next week. So I said, keep me posted. But anyway, the point being is that these things already exist. And what we really don't want to do is reinvent the wheel. We want to figure out how we can grease the wheel, I think. Keep the wheel moving, and using that scanning the horizons framework or the adaptation process, facilitate the actual whole process. You know, facilitate from planning to implementation to monitoring and evaluation to revisiting, et cetera, et cetera. Dennis?
I think, you know, the answer to many of these questions is that these are researchable issues that we need to come up with. That's why my initial answer is that I don't have one. That the issue of, I don't think the issue is not reinventing the wheel, is actually fixing it. I think there's a disconnect between the federal to the local level. That, you know, the issues of what's happening with the federal efforts for adaptation planning is misaligned to what really people need to do, are doing on the ground. And so I think we need to make these interconnections, and I think it's going to be multi-scaled. It's very much along the lines of what Maria indicated, of looking at various aspects at local scales. How do they mesh up to the national efforts? Where are the disconnects? Where are the gaps? Where are the leverage points to where we can actually engage better the federal willingness to help, but their inability to really scale down to the local level where action needs to take place. And I think there is a need for that interconnection, and we need to learn how to do that within a socially ecological framing.
The scaling down is the field managers, though. I mean, that's where the scaling down happens. So we have to think about, you know, the federal box isn't just one box. It all happens at the same level.
There's multiple dimensions that we need to work through, and need to be asking the right questions about how we actually start integrating and cross-fertilizing across those scales. And that's, I think, the research. And so a lot of what we're trying to do and develop in this group, I believe, will be contextual. And so how do we actually capture the appropriate level of interconnection around needs and implementation? To me, one of the research questions that I have in mind is that, can we address a research question that helps or enables implementation? And I don't know the answer to that. Now, hopefully, there's a lot of smart people in this room that can help us think through how do we actually do research on enabling implementation.
Or just what blocking.
All right, I'm going to talk. And,
Karina!
Two things that kind of, I think, anyway, I think both as an entity that both applies for and funds research, I think funding is a critical research stream, and how funding shapes, because the solicitation that you guys have put out clearly focused on having to be making a decision, having to be engaging with managers, having to be doing that co-production of knowledge. When a research proposal asks for that, that's what the research goes for. So I think that is an interesting space to look at the gaps between research and implementation and how funding streams can be geared more towards enabling implementation. And I think that there's I don't know, I think it's an interesting research agenda to look at that. And then my other thought about this question between the federal and the local scales, and it's not just the critical question, I think, is more around what you say about connecting the scales. And from what I looked at in my PhD was partially that question of how you do that, the role of something in the middle. There's so much conversation about national, local, or international locals, but no one really thinks about what's going on in the middle, and that as a climate science centre or network of people who are connected both up and down, that's something around thinking about the role of this organisation as being that bridging space.
Yeah, I can't tell you how many times when we were writing the adaptation chapter, Rosina Bierbaum kept saying, we got to figure out a way to connect the bit top with the bottom, and I'd say, the research and the CSCs, that's what they're there for. Yeah.
Has anybody done sort of a diagram of, I mean, you could look at it top down and bottom up, but starting at, say, in one agency, their mandates, their legal constraints that are directly related to what you're talking about, whether it's, adaptation or planning, down to the tools that they are sort of saying that their land managers are using.
And I said it's interesting. I don't think anybody from an LCC is here.
No, Kevin Johnson was supposed to be here, and he had to bail last minute because of a hand from above that gave him a deadline for today, so he couldn't actually.
This isn't anything I wouldn't say in front of the LCC folks. The national office, and it's like, I don't need a science coordinator from LCC. I need a decision coordinator.
Yeah.
And they kind of nod and go, well, the common answer is like, well, we know what decisions are. So it'd be great if you could share it with the rest of us. We could all kind of see. Because I think, Ginny, that's a really good point that we're lacking that.
Let me just point out, speaking from the agencies, I think all of the agencies have probably done exactly what Ginny said. In guarantees in the Park Service, we've examined their policy, we've examined their policy, how it relates to emerging issues like potential translocation, how it relates to our mission statement, what latitude park superintendents have in certain cases. And frequently it's not a simple issue. And then we are working to go down through that. And so, in the Forest Service, you've mentioned the roadmap and the scorecard that they have. We have our climate change strategy and our action plan. The Fish and Wildlife Service has their strategic habitat initiative. Federal agencies, management agencies, have to do that because without the legal authority, we're not private citizens. Private citizen, you can do anything that you're not prohibited from doing. As a federal employee, you can't do anything unless you have specific authorization from Congress to do it. So when we write task agreements, and you guys get them, you'll notice that the first paragraph in almost every task agreement lays out those authorities. Ours is like 43 CFR is our, kind of organic statements that gives us authority to manage land. So I would kind of issue that. And then the other thing is a lot of this discussion has talked about, our decisions and what we do. Keep in mind that we had the Bush administration. Okay, and so during the Bush administration,
I've been trying that.
Well, I mean, realistically, let's,
we're in denial.
Well, we can be in denial, but it meant that for about, until basically, Obama came along, I remember talking to people in the Park Service who worked in our interior building. They said when we wanted to talk about climate change, we closed the door to our office in case somebody was walking down the hallway. So the federal agencies were basically, 8 or 10 years behind the NGOs and others who could freely take on these kinds of things. So a lot of this stuff we're talking about is, and even when Lisa was talking about her survey, I thought, well, that actually is 2 years old. The last 2 years has, like the last 3 or 4 years in the federal agencies, at least from the people I've dealt with, anything that's 2 years old is out of date. I mean, it's just the kind of level of sophistication, the level of knowledge, the planning and the stuff that are going on is evolving so rapidly that if you set in your mindset, you read a paper that's 2 years old and you say this is where the federal agencies are, you've already missed it. I mean, you're sitting in the parking lot and we're down on the interstate the other thing to keep in mind is that when
It depends on the agency, John, I'll just say that. I don't think that all agencies are doing the same thing.
Others are a little farther behind, Park Service is a little bit ahead. But the other thing is that we have things like NEPA, and so when we do our management plan, one of the reasons that those actions aren't being taken in a lot of places is because of compliance. Yes. If you disturb the ground, you probably come under NEPA. And that really, really seriously sets things back. So a lot of these things are starting, and we all know the difficulties of identifying them, but I just kind of feel like it's important, since there's only a few of the feds here, to say that it's not quite as dismal as some of the presentations.
No, but it brings up a really interesting issue in my mind, which is, right, you're right. So basically 2009 was when all the action happened, when the executive order and within the DOI, the secretarial order came out to establish a lot of the adaptation.
Earlier than that, that's when the
But officially, yeah, that's when like the floodgates were open, and now we're all frantically writing 10 proposals at one time because now all the money's coming. But if we think about milestones, we think about the fact that we've got an election coming up right around the corner. We potentially only have a few years to be in the situation that we're in right now. I think that's a big reality check for us, and just to sort of file in the back of our minds. So what do we want to accomplish in the next few years, and what if we have a scenario where we go back? I mean, we could have another Bush in the White House in 3 years. Let's face it, people.
And I think this is keying in on something which really plays up with is, when we're talking about scenario development as a possible risk frame and such, I mean, so I'm just saying, you two do. I was looking at everything, and I didn't see, I'm sure this is in there, but kind of what are the policy decisions that could really be game changers, in the short term, and how do you characterize our, risk, vulnerability there? The other part, and kind of, I would love to see kind of what are the major decisions from all the agencies, kind of take the federal, the regional, kind of see that cascade down and how that impacts land manager decisions.
I guess I would turn the question around upside down, because, being in the climate change, global change arena for 25 years or more, working at that policy level, we actually need to be thinking about how do we actually incorporate our research applications and our usefulness that go beyond the policy. That we actually work, that the regional aspect is really an effort to really bring it down to the user community, that independent of federal funding, there's a need.
Yes, I would think that's indispensable.
Because, until we actually build that grassroots need for the type of climate change response actions that we're talking about, and information needs, we're screwed. We're not going to have any constituency in which...
It seems entirely different.
No, it's a
slight twist.
Because to me then, what we started back in 98, 97 with the first assessment, where we actually went to the stakeholders and said, regardless of climate, what is your vulnerabilities? And we asked a very basic question. And then we said, well, in those areas that you're vulnerable, this is how climate change will impact you. And we started a dialogue. Then 2000 happened, as we mentioned. We were in the dark period. Now we're coming back out of it. We're in a new domain. But we have to actually make the message stick with the user community. Otherwise, we're going to be in the same hole as we were, because things can change politically. So I don't think the policy analysis, a lot of that's been done. You could go to, Michelle Betzel, and you get great analysis of what,
Not for our region, though.
Well, it's close enough.
For example,
no, it's not.
Gigantic subsidies for biofuels that come from a federal level, and how would that is a game changer on a regional, local decision making. That's what I'm talking about. I'm not talking.
Not to mention the Keystone Pipeline will go through
Right.
our region.
So I'm just thinking about what are other decisions that are out of the control of the folks that are kind of the boots on the ground people that really can cascade and impact the region. So, but I completely understand what you're saying. It is slightly different.
Well, it's again merging scales.
It is.
We did scenario planning for our climate change program a few years ago, and one of the scenarios is that we got a budget increase. Another one was to take a 70% hit. This was actually months later. Our budget, we went from 10 billion to 3 million. We don't actually need a Bush administration to recognize large fluctuations in resource base. The scenario planning, like we talked about, Jeff was actually at the workshop last summer, and one of our scenarios of that was the New York City ecosystem. And the scenario that we developed there was that sea level rose and there was a giant surge and it flooded. We didn't recognize that we were 5 months before Hurricane Sandy. So these kinds of things you're talking about, I think that, from our perspective, I really appreciate, Dennis, what you said too, that be thinking about existing vulnerabilities. In our program, we've said we don't want our parks to do a climate change response plan because they're already inundated with general management plans, foundation documents, resource stewardship strategies, annual work plans, fire management plans, visitor safety plans. We want climate change to be incorporated into their existing framework and what they're doing now, and that's really where we're focusing on. Not this is a whole separate thing that you now have to add into your existing workload, but you have to incorporate it and make it a part of your routine business aggressively. So I think your approach is totally spot on.
Yeah, we're kind of doing the same thing, for example, working with communities. In the past, we always just develop a drop plan and all these things, and now we're finding out we have lots of plans to develop at the state level or the local level. They're trying to figure out how to merge climate issues into what they're already doing. And one of the areas we're looking into now is asset management. A community, they'll do an inventory of their resources and to see where they want to go in the future. Then they'll go and they'll say, well, these are our threats down the road. And usually climate isn't one of those usually. And so if we want to develop our infrastructure, if we want to build new wells, if we want to do something, this is how much of a cost, and they're supposed to take it out to their stakeholders and say, what are you willing to pay for? This level of risk, this, or this, what level of risk do you want to pay for it? Because it declines the more you prepare. And so, to us, that seems like a great place to put in climate risk. It's something they're already doing anyway, and it might be a nice tie in there. It would be nice to see what the federal managers are doing, if that's an area we're looking at, what they're already supposed to be doing for vulnerability assessment, and where we can go in there and help them.
On infrastructure, where you're looking at a 30 to 50-year timeline. Because, in our discussions with federal agencies on, sort of DOD and DOE, looking at their installations, and they're at that phase where after World War II, where a lot of those installations were put in place, now looking at a remodeling, refurbishing of those things, and looking at that timeline of that, is really important. DOD is really sort of ahead of that thinking.
And for the agencies, I think, there are certain activities that happen that the same holds true. My own research in Alaska, I was looking at this moose management plan, this quasi-collaborative moose management plan between the federal agencies, Fish and Wildlife Service, the Alaska Department of Fish and Game, and the tribes. And that plan had been done 10 years prior, and there was nothing in there about climate. And what they were experiencing were these seasonality shifts. And the plan didn't allow for that, and their decision-making process in the dual management system in Alaska didn't allow for it either. That's what I was trying to elucidate, is where do they need to include climate, and how are they basically overlooking the climate issue in here, because they were really thinking about climate as weather. And so without getting into the whole thing, I think, back to what several of us have said, is there are these existing, processes that are happening and have happened. I mean, the 1922 Colorado River Compact, we can talk about a lot of them. I think, trying to figure out how to get into those and understand where the climate sensitivities are and where this kind of integration is necessary is really kind of an overarching what I see as an overarching goal and an overarching need, but then how do we do that, I think, is a big question.
Just to build on what John said, and I think this is kind of similar to what I heard from LCTs, that we know it, we do it. We've done it, but I don't, and neither does the research community. And, I don't know if there's some way to, try to get an effort that says, this is the camper safety plan. This is your safety plan. And on a scale of 1 to 10, how much are you climate matter? Maybe that's about a 1. And then, when is that plan done? Okay, well, we did it in 2012, and we're not going to do it again until 2024. Okay, so that might be the one that we take off the books. But then there's the fire management plan that we update every year based on drought, and climate is probably 10, a scale of 1 to 10, and it's due in 2014. And so could we, that's where I want to sort of look, for each park or each management unit across our domain, I don't think that information exists, and it would be really interesting, I think, to try to lay that out.
And John, you at one point, we had a conversation about how valuable we both thought it would be for you to give a webinar on the Park Service decision process.
Actually, I think I volunteered John for that, but that's something you're talking about with the plans. In our climate change program in the Park Service, to Lee Willing's credit, she identified very early on that if the climate change program for the Park Service was to be effective, we had to be really integrated, absolutely integrated with our planning division. And so she actually hired Don Weeks as full-time employee paid by the response program that works directly with all the planning. We found it very difficult, even within our own agencies, that we looked at what were the plans coming up, and we particularly focused on foundation statements and general management plans as a place that we wanted to be integrally involved and get the schedule. Those are plans that are done by our Denver Service Center to get the annual calendar of which one of those were coming up so that we could provide information. I can tell you from the management side that one of the big frustrations of working with researchers is they really don't understand that when a management agency has a guideline, particularly when there's a lawsuit that's probably going to, be kicked off if they don't meet a deadline, information that comes in a week after the plan is turned in is wasted. You just spent a lot of money doing something that probably won't get in until the next cycle. And so understanding, Jeff's point is totally spot on.
Yeah.
If you can figure out, and we know that each, agencies and parks generally have an annual calendar for doing their work plans and all that sort of stuff. And that really applies also if you're working with those agencies, knowing that if, for example, you want to work in Rocky Mountain National Park and you need housing in the summer, you need to be making that application in like February, because that's when they do all of their advanced planning, and because of the federal budget process, all of this stuff operates on a calendar that's quite different than a research calendar.
Has anyone done seasonal calendars like that for the
Andrea
federal
Ray.
agencies?
Andrea.
Let me finish. For this region, for our North Central region. I mean, we've all done, Cody, you have a really cool one in your
Farmers.
for farmers, and you've done some similar stuff, and I've done it in Alaska. Do you have something in this region?
For water, I guess.
Well,
For the federal agencies?
well, not for across all, it would get messy really fast. But I mean, a lot of the water and ag ones are around,
Right.
but they back up to fine. When they decide what cultivar to plant, the order.
But I mean, I think doing something like this for the federal agencies also ties into this whole top of the discussion we were talking about, which is their local reality, their local seasons, their local seasonal calendar, their local seasonality, their observations about that, their knowledge about that. I mean, I think having that understanding is really critical for what we're trying to do.
We did it for our program, and we said, the right information in the right format for the right people at the right time. I mean, that's really what it comes down to. And so that right time is just this part of the discussion.
So with the more adaptation kind of planning, it's not necessarily around the cycle, but when did the forest management plans come up for review?
Yeah.
The BLM resource, RMPs, and those happen sometimes on a 5 or 10 year.
Right.
For the planning calendar.
Or, yeah.
Yes, ma'am.
Has anybody done an analysis across the federal agencies in the different ways that adaptation has been integrated into planning? Because I think Andrew Ashton, Mark Smith came up with this thing that I have here, which is a graph of different ways of thinking about how you would mainstream adaptation, and posing the question about what it is, like, what do you gain or lose from having someone who sits across a high level of thinking about adaptation across everything versus the climate person who does adaptation or work plans person or whatever. I mean, it seems like an opportunity for this climate science center because you are looking across multiple agencies to do that analysis.
Someone was working on some, who was it at the thing down in Denver? There was a session that was much like what you described, I think, basically. It was one of the NGOs that's been looking at how, either how to or how have agencies incorporated.
I think unfortunately that if you rely on the federal agencies to look at their own plans, that they're so biophysically based that there's, I mean, I see very little social ecological, the integrative view, that even the current PEQ roadmap for adaptation in wildlife conservation is so focused on just wildlife and which is, you can understand that, but there should be some effort to really look at, what is the, institutional framing, what's, how is it related to different livelihoods, because as you look at conservation efforts, especially like you were showing on the eastern part of our domain, it's private lands that we're dealing with. And so how do we incorporate that within the type of work that Fish and Wildlife does? It's appalling that we don't have a good way of really looking at a social ecological framing of it. So you could do the analysis, but I think it'd be kind of disappointing.
I think I think that we have, in part we as the Climate Science Center have started the right process to try and get at what we're talking about here, which is, with the solicitation, building into the solicitation this approach that hopefully we can get at some of these goals we're talking about. And I think, lunch is ready, by the way. We've got about 5 minutes left in this session. We've identified some kind of, I think, goals. I think something to think about maybe over lunch is what would some of the milestones and successes be to achieve these goals with the resources that we have. And maybe that's a conversation we can start to pick back up on after lunch, just as a suggestion. But I do think, we've got a lot evolving. We're going to be funding some projects that are of this philosophy to some degree. And then there's going to be some decisions made about directed funding. We're applying for projects, and one of the big issues that's been has come up as we've been writing proposals is, and I've experienced this a lot in my career to date, is that a lot of the funding agencies don't like to fund what we're talking about here in these big, gigantic proposals. And Jeff will remember one day, he was like, well, maybe you guys can write another proposal because I'm not sure if they're going to fund it. And I said, but Jeff, it's not going to get funded if we don't start putting it in our proposals now. We've got to try and get this, get this philosophy up into the agencies. But the risk of that then is that we just don't get funded. And I see that again and again and again. A lot of the NSF initiatives. NOAA has SARP that I think is one of the most promising out there. I know Kristen's making a face because it's a sad statement, but it's true. What does it stand for?
Sectoral application research.
Part of NOAA office,
Yeah. So, anyways, just to finish that thought, one of the things I'm thinking of is, I feel like what our Climate Science Center has to do, because remembering that we're kind of atypical of the rest of the Climate Science Centers too, in that they are, from what I understand, much more biophysically oriented. I don't know if any other social scientists have been hired yet in the CSC system. What we need to be able to do is demonstrate proof of concept. We need to be able to demonstrate that how this approach is effective. And so getting back to, okay, so what would that look like? What are these milestones and successes? What do we want to see come out of these projects over the next?
More effective adaptation than the people who don't speak about social skills.
Well, I mean, back to the goal is, facilitating the fixing the wheel, going through the cycle. I mean, that's exactly how the solicitation is written, that, the hope is that these projects can actually go through that cycle. But as we know from our research, it stops oftentimes at the planning stage. It doesn't get on the ground. You know, I heard someone use the term shovel ready as an analogy, you know, adaptation ready. I mean, that's really what we're talking about, is getting it from planning to you know, adaptation ready on the ground projects that can actually implement some of this stuff.
The Human Dimensions of Climate Change project, as I was talking about the case studies and the need to try and get information, you know, help folks who are decision making on the ground, get to a little bit of what you're talking about. The idea of the case studies would be to look at those, to ask those questions. What are the decisions that individuals are making? You know, where do they need that information? What information do they need? What information have they used? Where do they get it? And then if we can look at that across levels, you know, from the ground up, from the individual saying, I need to burn that area over there. I need to add water to that area there. I need to take some action. I mean, those are the questions that we want to be able to look at. What are those moving parts at that individual level, and build up from there in order to provide the information. So an outcome of that is a little bit of what that's talking about.
But you also need a metric of success, and I think it's interesting that I haven't heard anybody talk about, I don't know, talk about research dollars, but has there been a talk about, you know, if you want to communicate this outcome across scale of society, should we talk about dollars, cost, benefit, so that you have a common denominator to talk about?
So a metric of success of what?
So, like, we're talking about, you know, what are the decisions that you're making, but then I think the next question is, then what are the effects of those decisions? And effects on what? Effects on the economy? That might be a really strong way to communicate at every scale. So the individual scale, you know, if I decided to irrigate 10 acres of hay and I got 10 cows and I made a profit of, you know, $10,000, then that's something that you communicate up to the base decision-making process, and then how does the scenario with different water availability tie into my ability to make $10,000? And really trying to frame across those scales with a commitment that can be accomplished.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a noble point and effort. There's a lot of people trying to figure out how to do that for social indicators of vulnerability and adaptation, and it's really, really, really challenging. I think we have to push ourselves in that direction. You know, the National Climate Assessment is working on this. There's a lot of people thinking about this. You know, I think a lot of us here know the problem. I mean, you said it in one of your presentations the other day. One very real issue is it's hard to measure things that don't happen.
Yeah.
You know, it's also hard to measure things that take a really long time to show results, which a lot of adaptation initiatives are. So those are some of the realities of, you know, and just simply going beyond cost-benefit analysis and economic indicators for success. Measuring societal indicators for a lot of stuff, especially risk-oriented stuff, is just really, really challenging. Bob? We got a break for lunch in a minute, so.
Just some things I heard after.
Yeah.
After Bob said his
Good, because I was going to comment on what Jack was saying. Take this metaphor, we are not the doctor, we're a consulting doctor. The agencies aren't the patients. The patients are the skeptics, the users, the end users. And our agency people don't know. Can we even talk to them about climate? We don't know if we should or not, can we? Don't really understand. Because they're the ones who live in weather, and that's where they live. We don't. And if there's a way that scientifically we can take that understanding and bring it to the social problems that we're facing through adaptation, and I heard a great sigh of relief with the adaptation forum. It was like, finally, the science is in, and we're now talking about what the hell are we going to do about it. And that was sort of the sigh of relief I heard in the last 2 days in Denver. And it was like, yeah, okay, let's get on with that kind of piece. And I think that there's an obligation for the science to recognize that most people don't live in that abstraction, and we know it intellectually, but how do we get there? And I think the shift of the metaphor not to think we've got to deal with the decision makers as much as who are the decision makers having to deal with and how to best give them a product they can deliver to them in an understandable, intelligent way. That's why I like that human dimensions piece of the voluntary, the geographic piece and all of that. I think that's really going to be getting at how do we get our message into those realms.
So we need to tie this up. I've got my 2 directors and my co-organizers who all have burning comments, so I'm going to let them go, and then we're going to have lunch, and we can certainly continue the conversation over lunch and after lunch. And I think you read my mind. Are we eating lunch over there and here, or kind of both?
Yeah, it's set up over there, so kind of over
But should we just bring it back in here probably for space? Okay. So, I mean, we can continue talking, what? Outside the building?
There's oxygen.
Yeah. Oh, oh, out there, or like in the courtyard, kind of? That's an option. It's not, comfy.
No, there's tables out.
Oh, where?
As you walk towards Clark, you just go.
Follow him.
Who's the non-we person? Okay, cool. Just making sure I'll tell you your thing later.
All right, so, Josh.
I'll try to make it quick, that, with Geneva's comment, I think that Rudy's branch has some of the, at least in Department of Interior, leaders in that connection of economic value and benefit to non-tangible goods.
Right.
Related to the proposal idea, this was a NASA proposal, and their idea of interdisciplinary is like you're looking at 2 different sections of electromagnetic spectrum. So, it's good, we're trying, but, we're getting to it. And the third thing is the idea that Andrea said, like, it gets complicated really quickly, and I've heard that before at a Park Service meeting, and, so are climate models. Yeah. These are not easy, and we're projecting to 2100.
At least you have physics first principles.
Well, that's it, right? So, I've got a spreadsheet of the park units in the north central domain in the 7 states, and there's 691 of them. That includes like field stations. But that's finite. I mean, that's not 6,000, it's not 60,000, it's 691. I mean, we have to send out surveys to more people than this regularly. So, I think that we need to start, I understand what Dennis is saying, I agree, but you got to start with data. And let's, think about this 691 number. It's not insurmountable to start to generate the data. And then you start to think about the data-driven, okay, how much of these plans were influenced by a national policy, how much we're responding to, how much we're feeding into. So you can start to play around with it, but I think we're sort of lacking data in this domain. And let's not think of it as this thing that's too complicated. Let's think of it as finite. And we try things.
There's only 300 GMPs.
We dig into it, it is complicated, but so is a lot.
Science is hard.
So, my reflection, I guess, of our discussion so far is that one of the research gaps that we can help fill that would be unique is really that interface between the planning and implementation component. Really looking at, are there institutional restructuring that we need to do? Is there something that we can learn from the management decision-making calendars? How do we incorporate these things so that the usefulness of the research that we do can really get into that implementation space? And I think then the topics of the type of vulnerability assessments and risk framing that we do, the indicators of metrics, the perceptions and values, start fitting into how do we use those bits of information to move toward implementation and make our research useful in a way that's really embedded into the decision-making framing that people are doing.
So I would just like to make a plug for the fact that this approach that I have used, that Lisa Dilling has used, that Susie Moser has used, of, looking at adaptive capacities, barriers, and opportunities that either inhibit or facilitate this days is out there. I think we need more of it.
Yeah.
I think we need lots more of it.
And we need to do it within our region, within our stakeholder communities. So I think, to me, as a pitch for what we discussed this afternoon, to me, that sort of linkage would be a useful space for discussion.
Right. Nina had one quick comment.
I have a quick process thing. So I didn't interrupt everybody when I was recording stuff because the conversation was flowing. So, and I know that Geneva's taking really good notes and capturing a lot of what you're saying. But if there's something up here that you said or that you want to add to or edit, the black pen actually shows it better than the other one. But just feel free during lunch.
Is that a permanent marker, though?
It's not. I thought that was
okay.
But feel free to edit, add, knowing that there's a really good record of the whole meeting that
yeah. And there's this stuff over here, too, that I've been kind of filling the holes when I don't see you writing or binning it in my bins over here, so. Yes, thank you. I was hoping someone would remind me of that. Is it, I was going to after lunch, more like not in. Yeah, and I don't know, John, probably an issue with the numbers. How do I get back to the jury?
Clerk service one up?
Yeah, we still
Fish and wildlife service, yeah.
I mean, 70% of the offices now. Traffic plan with the national We surveyed everybody in every office all the time. So I think I know it has probably a process going, but it's not that there's a lot of especially in BLM. Those two
I know. There's a workaround, but it's only that 24 hours.
I don't have anybody.
It was, and she's
took that.
very nice.
Oh, it was.
We did a survey in 2011,
Oh,
and then it's published 1 year later. It's incredibly fast.
I thought I had about that. I think on target and then bring in, how do we
Which
a lot of the questions were more focused on, what I'm what the barriers are, and how information be used.
Yeah, good.
Well, we could do a survey. The problem is people let people know ahead, or I don't want to run into the same issues about politics.
Well, that's my. But there is some. There's a good paper that was a meta.
We've thought of that, but I'm glad to hear you say that you got a project like that funded because
Well, it's science first, and then the place-based science education, interaction and outreach is what,
So it's a different, it is different.
so different for sure.
that's important.
So
Talk about that when we're talking about
through,
that, because I think that's
this from raw experience, I see that.
Oh, it is.
That's what.
Yeah. All right.
in this time period.
Yeah,
All the time.
that's what I was trying to do.
That'd be great. That even
I think there might be a way, I like the
because
idea.
I'm totally jaded because I've been part of proposals that they just, you know, in looking
Well,
at
if
what
that
they've
comes
funded
first,
in
it
the
won't
past.
get it.
And that's a great point, that's a great
Yeah,
point.
but that program